On the remote Bavarian farm known as Hinterkaifeck, situated in the isolated Schwangau region of southern Germany, one of the most perplexing and disturbing mass murders in European history unfolded during the winter of 1932, leaving behind questions that persist to this day without satisfactory answers. The farmstead was home to Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazilia, their daughter Victoria, Victoria's two children Casimir and Maria, and a maid named Maria Baumgartner. And in early March, all 6 residents were found brutally murdered in a manner so methodical and calculated that it suggested a perpetrator possessed of considerable physical strength, psychological detachment, and intimate knowledge of the household. The bodies were discovered in the farmhouse after weeks of isolation, arranged in positions suggesting they had been killed in their sleep with mattocks and axes. Their remains left decomposing, while livestock remained unfed, and the property descended into an eerie, inexplicable silence that the neighboring farmers found so profoundly unsettling that they avoided approaching the structure entirely. What renders this case uniquely disturbing is not merely the violence itself, but the psychological architecture surrounding it, for in the weeks preceding the murders, Andreas Gruber had become increasingly paranoid and distressed, reportedly claiming that someone was haunting the farm, that he had witnessed mysterious footprints in the snow leading from the forest toward his home, and that some invisible, malevolent presence had invaded his sanctuary and demanded his family's destruction. The psychological mechanism at work here appears to involve a complete dissolution of the boundary between external threat and internal psychosis, wherein genuine isolation and rural vulnerability transformed into a paranoid ideation so consuming that murder became, in the perpetrator's fractured reasoning, a necessary act of protection or desperate retribution. In February of 1959, a group of 9 experienced Soviet mountaineers set out to traverse the northern Urals during winter, a challenging but not unprecedented undertaking for skilled climbers of their caliber. The expedition was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old student with considerable mountaineering experience, and the team consisted of other young Soviet hikers ranging from 20 to 24 years old, all well-trained and equipped for winter conditions in that remote region. On the night of February 1st, the team established their camp on the slopes of what would become known as Dead Mountain, and for reasons that remain entirely unexplained, in the middle of the night, all 9 members of the expedition cut their way out from the inside of their tent and fled into the surrounding wilderness in conditions of extreme cold, darkness, and snow. When search parties eventually located the tent weeks later, they found it partially collapsed and torn open from within, with sleeping bags still inside and personal belongings scattered about, suggesting a sudden and panicked evacuation rather than an orderly departure. The bodies were discovered over the following weeks scattered across the landscape in various states of decomposition, some partially buried in snow, some showing signs of extreme physical trauma including fractured ribs, a crushed skull, and missing eyes and tongues, injuries that could not be logically explained by exposure or avalanche. Yet the official Soviet investigation concluded the deaths were caused by hypothermia resulting from an unknown compelling force. What makes this incident so psychologically unsettling is not merely the mystery of what could have driven 9 rational, experienced people to abandon shelter and run into lethal conditions, but rather the quality of the terror itself, the apparent conviction that whatever threat they perceived inside that tent was more immediately dangerous than freezing to death in the Siberian night. On December 2, 1872, the merchant ship Mary Celeste was discovered adrift in the Atlantic Ocean, abandoned by its entire crew with no apparent explanation, a maritime phenomenon that would captivate the imaginations of investigators and the public for generations to come. The ship was found in relatively good condition, with sails still partially deployed, cargo intact, lifeboats missing except for one, and personal belongings scattered about as though the occupants had left in sudden haste or confusion. Yet there were no signs of struggle, no blood upon the decks, and no evidence of violence or mutiny that might explain such a hasty departure. The captain's logbook indicated that all was well just 10 days prior. The crew numbered 13 souls in total, including the captain's family, and the circumstances suggested that every single person had vanished into the sea under circumstances that defied rational explanation, leaving behind an almost deliberately enigmatic scene that seemed designed to perplex and unsettle all who encountered it. What makes the Mary Celeste so psychologically troubling is not merely the mystery itself, but rather the way our minds naturally construct narratives to fill the void of the unknown, inventing scenarios of supernatural intervention, cosmic phenomena, or elaborate conspiracies when the truth may be far simpler and far more mundane, perhaps involving a gas leak, a navigational panic, or miscalculation that sent the crew overboard in desperation or confusion. The human brain abhors genuine uncertainty and will fabricate increasingly elaborate explanations rather than accept that some events simply lack complete documentation or clear causal chains, and the Mary Celeste has become a repository for these invented horrors, spawning hundreds of fictional accounts, ghost stories, and sensationalized narratives that bear little resemblance to the actual documented facts. In November of 1926, a trapper named Joe Labelle was traveling through the remote Canadian wilderness near Lake Anjikuni in the Kivalliq region of Nunavut, when he stumbled upon something that would become one of the most famous mysteries of the North American frontier. He discovered an Inuit village that appeared to have been abandoned in haste, with the inhabitants seemingly vanishing without explanation, leaving behind all their possessions, their dogs, and their food stores in a way that suggested they had left in a moment of urgent panic or supernatural compulsion. The hut still contained personal belongings and hunting equipment, the fires had been extinguished, and most disturbingly, the sled dogs that would have been essential for survival in that harsh climate were found dead, having apparently starved rather than having been taken by their owners on any kind of journey. What makes this account so unsettling is the psychological mechanism of abandonment and the violation of the fundamental human instinct to preserve life, both one's own and that of animals dependent upon oneself, suggesting that whatever prompted the exodus was compelling enough to override survival logic itself. However, the Lake Anjikuni disappearance has never been adequately verified by historical records, and most researchers cannot locate definitive documentation of the event or even confirmation that such a village existed in that specific location. Yet the story persists in popular culture and paranormal discussion with remarkable tenacity, retold and expanded upon across decades despite the absence of corroborating evidence, suggesting that our collective imagination finds comfort in mysteries that may not have occurred, filling the void of the unknown with narratives that feel true enough to merit repetition and belief. In December of 1948, a man was discovered dead on a beach near Adelaide, Australia, slumped against a seawall in an area known as Somerton Beach, and what followed became one of the most perplexing unsolved mysteries of the 20th century, a case that has resisted every attempt at logical explanation and remains shrouded in an almost supernatural quality of obscurity. The man was impeccably dressed in expensive clothing despite the summer heat, wearing a tie and jacket, and his body bore no obvious signs of violence or struggle, yet he appeared to have been poisoned, his death preceded by what witnesses described as a period of acute distress and physical decline in the hours before he was found. What made this case truly extraordinary was the complete absence of identifying information about the deceased, a situation so total and so thorough that it suggested either an impossible coincidence or a deliberate, almost professional erasure of identity, as every label in his clothing had been meticulously removed, and his fingerprints matched no existing records in any law enforcement database across the entire world. The investigation that unfolded revealed increasingly strange details, including the discovery of a suitcase nearby containing a change of clothes, and most mysteriously, a small piece of paper that had been hidden in a secret compartment of the man's trousers, bearing only the words Tam and Shud, which is a reference to the final section of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a Persian poem about mortality and the inevitable end of all things. The psychological mechanism that draws us to this case involves the fundamental human need for narrative closure and comprehensible tragedy, yet the Somerton Man offers neither, presenting instead a complete void where answers should exist, a mathematical impossibility of anonymity that our minds struggle to accommodate, because such total erasure runs counter to the basic documentary nature of modern existence. Deep in the Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University sits one of history's most perplexing artifacts, a leather-bound codex known as the Voynich Manuscript, a text of approximately 240 pages filled with an unknown script that has resisted decipherment for over 5 centuries, containing detailed botanical illustrations of plants that do not appear to exist in any known taxonomy. Alongside elaborate astronomical diagrams and what appear to be anatomical drawings of human figures that seem anatomically impossible in their configuration. The manuscript was discovered in 1912 by rare book dealer Wilfrid Voynich in a Roman villa, and subsequent carbon dating has confirmed its origins to approximately the early 15th century, making it a contemporary document from the Renaissance period, yet its origins remain entirely obscure and its authorship perpetually unknown. What makes the Voynich manuscript particularly unsettling is not merely that it cannot be read, but rather that its very existence suggests an intelligence deliberately obscuring meaning, as if someone centuries ago felt compelled to create an elaborate communication device specifically designed to frustrate comprehension, filling hundreds of pages with what may be methodical gibberish or what may be profound knowledge encoded beyond our current capacity to understand. The human mind finds such ambiguity deeply disturbing because we are pattern recognition machines fundamentally dependent upon the ability to extract meaning from symbols and language, and confronted with something that mimics the structure of communication while remaining utterly impenetrable, our cognitive systems become genuinely distressed, unable to determine whether we are looking at genius or madness, intention or accident. On the morning of January 15, 1947, a woman walking through a vacant lot in Los Angeles made a discovery that would become one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history. The body she found belonged to Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old aspiring actress known in local circles as the Black Dahlia, a nickname derived from a film noir movie and her preference for dark clothing. What made this case particularly disturbing was not merely the fact of her death, but the extraordinary brutality inflicted upon her remains. Her body had been severed completely in half at the waist with surgical precision, her face slashed from the corners of her mouth toward her ears in what became known as a Glasgow smile, and her entire body had been meticulously drained of blood and washed clean before being positioned deliberately in the vacant lot like a grotesque artistic statement. The killer had taken time to arrange her, suggesting not a crime of passion, but one of calculated sadism and control. The psychological mechanism that made this crime so captivating to the public consciousness lay in the collision of glamorous Hollywood mythology with brutal reality, the shattering of the dream narrative that young women pursued in Los Angeles. Every detail was meticulously documented, photographed, and disseminated through newspapers that competed ferociously for readership, each publication sensationalizing aspects of Elizabeth's life before her death, her relationships, her aspirations, creating a narrative that transformed her from a human being into a symbol. Despite intensive investigations involving hundreds of suspects and leads that stretched across decades, the case remained unsolved, yet it persisted in cultural memory not because of any resolution or justice achieved, but because the mystery itself became more valuable than closure, more compelling than facts, allowing each generation to project their own anxieties about violence, beauty, and mortality onto the blank canvas of an unsolved crime that continues to inspire books, films, and documentaries nearly 80 years later. On the night of December 30th, 2000, in the upscale Sedlec ward of Tokyo, Japan, a family of 4 was brutally murdered in their home in what remains one of Japan's most infamous unsolved crimes. The Miyazaki family, consisting of Father Mikio, Mother Yasuko, and their 2 young children, were discovered the following morning by a delivery person, their bodies arranged in their bedrooms in positions suggesting they had been killed while sleeping or in a state of vulnerability. The killer or killers had spent considerable time in the home after committing the murders, eating food from the refrigerator, taking baths, and watching television, suggesting a disturbing comfort with the violence that had just been committed. The investigation revealed fingerprints, DNA evidence, and even personal items left behind, yet despite the wealth of forensic evidence and one of the largest investigations in Japanese criminal history involving thousands of suspects, the case has remained unsolved for over 2 decades. The psychological mechanism at work in such cases involves what criminologists call the illusion of safety in domestic spaces, where victims are most vulnerable precisely because they are in environments designed to protect them, and where the killer operates with the knowledge that the very intimacy of the home provides a false sense of security that prevents victims from recognizing danger until it is far too late. The perpetrator existed comfortably in the boundary between the family's most private moments and their worst nightmare, suggesting either profound psychopathology or a calculated understanding of human vulnerability and the architecture of trust. In the early morning hours of June 11, 1912, the small town of Villisca, Iowa, was awakened to a nightmare that would define the community for generations to come. The Moore family, consisting of parents Josiah and Sarah, alongside their 4 children, had been systematically murdered in their beds with an axe, their bodies discovered by neighbors who had come to check on the family after noticing something terribly amiss. The killer had not simply committed the murders and departed, but instead remained in the home for several hours after the killings, covering the mirrors with cloth, turning the victims' faces away, and methodically cleaning certain areas while leaving others in grotesque disarray, as though engaged in some ritualistic performance that transcended the act of murder itself. This peculiar behavior at the crime scene suggested a killer operating under a psychological framework far more complex than simple rage or passion. Someone whose actions indicated a disturbing need to control and reorganize the environment around his victims even after they had ceased to exist. The investigation that followed was plagued by false confessions, incompetent police work, and the town's desperate need to find closure, leading to the arrest of Henry Moore, a traveling railroad worker, though the evidence linking him to the crimes remained circumstantial at best. What makes the Villisca murders particularly unsettling is how they have persisted in American folklore not as a solved case brought to justice, but as an ambiguous tragedy where the true perpetrator may have escaped accountability entirely, allowing the murders to exist in a state of eternal uncertainty where the genuine killer might have simply vanished into the vast landscape of early 20th century America. His identity lost to history, while the cloth-covered mirrors and the axe remain as symbols of inexplicable brutality that defied easy explanation or rational understanding. In the spring of 1972, in the quiet English town of Hexham in Northumberland, 2 stone heads were discovered buried in a garden, and their origin remains one of archaeology's most perplexing mysteries. The first head was unearthed by a young boy digging in his garden, a carved stone object roughly the size of a grapefruit, featuring crude but deliberate facial features with deep-set eye sockets and an almost brutish expression frozen in stone. Within weeks, a second head was found nearby, similarly carved and equally unsettling in its primitive appearance. Local archaeologists initially believed these artifacts might date back to Roman times, given that Hexham sits near Hadrian's Wall, and such carved stones occasionally emerge from the ground in that region. However, detailed examination suggested something far more uncertain and troubling, as the craftsmanship did not perfectly match known Roman techniques, and the style seemed almost anomalously crude for such precise ancient work. The heads disappeared into obscurity for decades, their origins never definitively established, which created a void that speculation quickly filled. Some theorists proposed they were prehistoric Neolithic artifacts, while others suggested they were hoaxes created by local stonemasons centuries earlier, or even modern fabrications designed to perplex and entertain. What makes the Hexham heads genuinely unsettling is not the objects themselves, but rather the profound uncertainty surrounding them, a mystery that demonstrates how little we truly understand about the history beneath our own soil. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our deep need to categorize and understand our world, and when we encounter objects that defy easy classification, they create an almost cognitive dissonance that troubles us. The heads remain unresolved because they challenge our ability to construct a coherent narrative of the past, leaving us suspended between multiple possibilities with no definitive answer. Beginning in the 1980s and continuing into the 2000s, mysterious tile mosaics began appearing embedded in the asphalt of city streets across North America, from Philadelphia to Los Angeles, each one displaying cryptic messages that seemed to emanate from a singular obsessive mind dedicated to broadcasting an urgent, incomprehensible plea to the world. These tiles, typically measuring around 3 feet in length and composed of ceramic and adhesive materials, would be painstakingly placed into streets by an unknown individual or group operating under the banner of the Toynbee movement, a name likely derived from historian Arnold J. Toynbee, whose work on civilizations and historical cycles may have inspired the tiler's philosophical fixation. The messages themselves ranged from variations on a core theme. Toynbee idea in movie 2001, A Space Odyssey resurrect dead on planet Jupiter, repeated endlessly across tiles in different cities, sometimes altered with additional cryptic references or instructions that suggested the creator possessed knowledge of some cosmic truth that demanded immediate worldwide attention. The psychological mechanism behind such elaborate, persistent street art installations reveals an individual gripped by what psychologists might identify as obsessive delusional thinking, a condition wherein the affected person becomes convinced of a singular idea's paramount importance and dedicates tremendous resources, time, and effort toward its propagation, despite the absence of any reasonable evidence supporting their conviction. This creator, whoever they were, felt compelled to physically alter public infrastructure across multiple states and over multiple decades, treating the asphalt of American streets as their canvas for broadcasting a message that most observers would dismiss as nonsensical ramblings. Yet the Tyler continued undeterred, suggesting a psychological mechanism so deeply rooted that no amount of public indifference could dissuade them from their mission. In January of 2011, a mysterious image appeared on the internet with no explanation, no context, and no clear purpose, containing only a question mark and an embedded message that read, "Hello, we are looking for highly intelligent individuals." This cryptic posting marked the beginning of what would become one of the most elaborate and deliberately obscure puzzles ever created on the global network, a challenge that seemed designed specifically to test not just the intellectual capacity of those who encountered it, but their psychological tolerance for uncertainty and their willingness to descend into increasingly abstract layers of complexity without any guarantee of reward or meaningful conclusion. The puzzle, which became known as Cicada 3301, was so deliberately convoluted that it required participants to decode images using steganographic techniques, solve complex mathematical problems, convert hexadecimal code into plain text, and follow breadcrumb trails that led across multiple websites, forums, and physical locations in different countries, each step revealing only the suggestion that another step existed, with no final destination ever truly confirmed. What made this phenomenon psychologically disturbing was not the puzzle itself, but what it represented about human nature and our relationship with mystery. The way that hundreds of thousands of people became completely consumed by the need to solve something specifically designed to have no concrete solution, the way that the absence of purpose became its own purpose, and the way that intelligent individuals could spend countless hours pursuing an objective that had no real-world benefit or closure. The puzzle appeared again in 2012 and 2013, each time with slightly different formats and slightly different challenges, yet each time attracting the same devoted following of people willing to sacrifice their time and mental energy to chase something deliberately obscure. On November 22, 1987, 2 television broadcasts in Chicago were hijacked by an unidentified individual or group who inserted a deeply unsettling figure into the signal, a grotesque parody of the Max Headroom character that had become famous through advertising and entertainment, except this version was wrong in nearly every conceivable way, distorted and jerky and wrong, speaking in an artificially modulated voice that seemed almost inhuman. And the figure would appear unexpectedly during legitimate broadcasts, interrupting the scheduled programming with increasingly bizarre and disturbing content that ranged from incomprehensible rambling to what appeared to be deliberate psychological harassment of the viewers at home. The incident occurred during evening news broadcasts on 2 separate Chicago stations, WGN and WTTW, when the signal was somehow intercepted and overridden by an unknown party who possessed the technical knowledge and equipment to execute what amounted to a pirate television broadcast, inserting this grotesque Max Headroom figure, sometimes accompanied by disturbing audio, sometimes accompanied by seemingly random imagery or flashing patterns, creating an experience that was disorienting and uncomfortable to watch, and the authorities were unable to trace the source of the transmission despite extensive investigation. What makes this incident psychologically fascinating is how it exploited the inherent vulnerability of broadcast television during that era, how it weaponized a figure that had been designed to seem friendly and entertaining, and transformed it into something fundamentally disturbing through simple distortion and context, demonstrating how the uncanny valley operates in real time, how our brains respond with deep unease when something familiar becomes wrong in subtle but undeniable ways. When the comfortable becomes threatening simply through minor alterations that we cannot quite articulate. On May 11, 1997, the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration detected an extraordinarily loud, low-frequency underwater sound traveling through the depths of the southern Pacific Ocean, originating from a point somewhere near the Ross Sea off the coast of Antarctica. And this sound, which came to be known as the bloop, was so immensely powerful that it registered on hydrophones positioned thousands of miles away across the ocean floor. Suggesting a source of almost incomprehensible magnitude, Yet when scientists and marine biologists began their investigations into what could possibly have created such a sound, they found themselves confronted with a profound mystery that would persist for years, as no known animal appeared large enough or powerful enough to generate such an acoustic signature, and the sound itself possessed characteristics that seemed both biological and utterly alien to human experience. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with the bloop operates on a fundamental level of human anxiety regarding the unknown depths of our own world. For despite decades of oceanic exploration and technological advancement, the vast majority of the ocean remains unmapped and unobserved. And the discovery of an enormous sound originating from one of Earth's most remote and inhospitable regions triggered primal fears about what might exist in those crushing depths beyond our comprehension or detection. Fears that are amplified by the sound's apparent size and the silence that followed it, leaving us with questions rather than answers. On the evening of August 15, 1977, a radio astronomer named Jerry Amon was sitting at Ohio State University's Big Ear Radio Telescope facility, monitoring signals from deep space in search of extraterrestrial intelligence, when he noticed something extraordinary printed on the data paper emerging from the detection equipment. A signal so unusual and so perfectly aligned with what scientists had theorized alien communication might look like that he circled it on the printout and wrote the word "wow" in the margin, a reaction that would define the signal forever and haunt the scientific community for decades to come. The signal lasted for 72 seconds, arriving on a frequency of 1420 MHz, which is a frequency known to be protected and largely unused for terrestrial broadcasting, making its origin seemingly impossible to explain through conventional means, and it displayed characteristics that matched no known natural phenomenon, no satellite, no radar reflection, and no interference from any human technology that scientists could identify or account for. What made the signal even more disturbing was that it exhibited what appeared to be intelligent design. It was narrowband, meaning it was concentrated in a very tight frequency range rather than scattered across a wide spectrum like natural cosmic phenomena tend to be, which is exactly what you would expect if an advanced civilization were deliberately trying to send a focused message across the vast distances of space. Beginning in late 2016, American diplomats and intelligence officers stationed in Havana, Cuba began reporting a peculiar constellation of symptoms that would come to define one of the most mysterious health phenomena of the modern era. These individuals described experiencing sudden attacks of intense pressure in their heads, followed by hearing strange sounds ranging from mechanical grinding to high-pitched chirping or piercing whistles that seemed to emanate from no identifiable source. The sensations would arrive without warning, sometimes occurring in their homes, sometimes in their hotel rooms, occasionally in public spaces, and they would leave the victims disoriented, nauseated, and cognitively impaired for days or weeks afterward. Some reported permanent hearing loss, while others developed persistent headaches, memory problems, and balance difficulties that fundamentally altered their quality of life. By the time the phenomenon was formally acknowledged, nearly 30 diplomatic personnel had reported incidents, and the American government launched official investigations into whether some form of directed acoustic or microwave weapon had been deployed against their staff by a hostile foreign actor, most suspiciously Cuba or Russia. The psychological mechanism underlying the Havana Syndrome operates through the intersection of genuine physiological harm, genuine uncertainty about causation, and the human mind's desperate need to impose narrative coherence upon unexplained suffering. When people experience real pain without a clear explanation, they naturally gravitate toward the most ominous interpretation available because it at least provides the comfort of knowing what is happening to them, even if that something is terrifying. The ambiguity itself becomes unbearable, making a concrete threat, even a weaponized one, preferable to the void of not knowing. What makes the Havana Syndrome persistently disturbing is that despite years of investigation by multiple government agencies, the National Academies of Sciences, and independent researchers, no conclusive explanation has emerged. In February of 1948, maritime radio operators across the Indian Ocean began receiving a series of increasingly desperate distress calls from a vessel identifying itself as the Orang Medan, a Dutch freighter traveling through the Strait of Malacca carrying a cargo of phosphorus and other volatile materials. The messages that crackled through the static painted a scene of absolute horror, with operators reporting that the unknown sender's voice described all officers dead, lying in chartroom and bridge, stiff and cold, with the crew also dead or dying, before the transmission abruptly ceased with the haunting final words that there was nothing else to do and goodbye. Multiple ships in the vicinity, including the American freighter City of Baltimore and the British freighter Ben Lomond, reported receiving these calls and attempted to locate the vessel, eventually discovering what they described as a completely silent ship with all its crew members found dead throughout the vessel, their bodies contorted in poses of extreme agony and terror, with facial expressions frozen in what witnesses described as absolute fear. Yet no apparent cause of death and no obvious signs of violence or struggle. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not merely the mystery of the deaths themselves, but the complete and total absence of any verifiable record of the Orang Maidan's existence in any shipping registries, maritime records, or official documentation from that era, leading many maritime historians to question whether the ship ever actually existed at all. The psychological mechanism behind this enduring mystery lies in humanity's fundamental unease with the unexplained and our desperate need to construct narratives around gaps in our knowledge, particularly when those gaps involve maritime disasters, which have always occupied a special place in our collective anxiety, perhaps because the ocean represents a realm where our control is limited and where death comes with a particular finality. In March of 1976, 5 young men from Yuba County, California, disappeared under circumstances so peculiar and contradictory that decades later, the case remains unsolved and deeply unsettling to those who examine it carefully. Gary Mathias, Jack Madruga, Jack Smith, Bill Sterling, and Ted Weiher were enjoying an evening at a local basketball game when they decided to leave early and head home, a decision that would mark the beginning of one of California's most haunting mysteries. Their car was found abandoned on a rural road with the engine still running, doors unlocked, and windows down despite the cold night, suggesting a sudden and urgent departure that made no logical sense given their isolated location. What followed was a series of discoveries so strange and fragmented that each piece seemed to defy rational explanation, yet when assembled together, they painted a portrait of inexplicable terror and disorientation. Over the following weeks and months, the men were found scattered across the landscape, some miles from the vehicle, some in locations they should not have been able to reach, and some displaying signs of exposure and injury inconsistent with the timeline of events. The psychological mechanism at work in such cases often involves how our minds struggle to process information that violates our fundamental understanding of cause and effect, leading us to either dismiss the evidence or construct elaborate theories that themselves become increasingly implausible. What makes the Yuba County 5 case particularly disturbing is not simply that it remains unsolved, but rather that despite having numerous official investigations, interviews, and physical evidence, no explanation has ever surfaced that accounts for all the documented facts without contradiction or impossibility. We have learned to live with this uncertainty, to file it away among the hundreds of other unsolved disappearances and deaths that populate our historical record, treating it as merely another mystery rather than confronting the deeper implications of how completely unpredictable human fate can sometimes become. On the night of December 25, 1945, in Fayetteville, West Virginia, 10 children vanished without explanation from their family home, leaving behind one of the most perplexing disappearances in American history that remains completely unsolved to this day. The Sodder family, consisting of George and Jenny Sodder along with their 14 children, experienced a fire that broke out in their 2-story wood frame house just after midnight. And when the smoke cleared and the flames subsided, 5 of their youngest children were simply gone, with no bodies recovered, no clear explanation for their absence, and no definitive evidence of what had occurred to them during those crucial hours. The official investigation concluded that the children had perished in the fire, yet the parents discovered troubling inconsistencies that contradicted this narrative, including an untouched pile of clothing in one of the bedrooms and a complete absence of any human remains despite the intense heat that supposedly claimed their lives. The psychological mechanism behind this case operates through the intersection of parental desperation and investigative negligence, where grieving parents clung to alternative theories because the official explanation seemed to defy the very laws of physics and forensic logic that should have left some trace of their children behind. The Sodder family spent decades pursuing leads, receiving mysterious phone calls from a woman claiming to have seen their son alive in a distant location, and maintaining their conviction that the children had been abducted rather than cremated, yet no conclusive evidence ever materialized to support any single theory. On August 21, 1966, two Brazilian men were discovered dead on a hillside near Rio de Janeiro, lying side by side in matching suits, their faces covered with homemade lead masks that had been carefully constructed and placed over their eyes before death occurred. The men, identified as Marcelo de Andrade and José Inacio Diaz, had planned to meet on that hillside, and when their bodies were found, they were positioned with absolute symmetry, their positioning suggesting either a ritualistic arrangement or a coordinated event that had been agreed upon beforehand. Between the bodies lay a handkerchief, an empty water bottle, and scattered around the scene were notes written in Portuguese that cryptically referenced the need to protect themselves from the sun, along with instructions about the lead masks themselves, which appeared to have been constructed specifically for this purpose. The masks were crude but deliberate constructions, suggesting that whoever created them had spent considerable time and effort on their design, and the fact that both men wore identical versions implies either a shared belief system or an agreement about what was necessary for whatever ritual or event they intended to undergo on that hillside. The circumstances of their deaths remain officially undetermined, with no clear evidence of murder, yet equally no clear explanation for why two rational adults would independently choose to seal their faces in lead and position themselves with such deliberate precision on a remote hilltop. Theories have proliferated over the decades, ranging from shared delusion or psychotic break to elaborate roleplay gone wrong, to speculation about UFO encounters or secret government experimentation that was being conducted on Brazilian citizens. On the 1st of December in 1948, a man was found dead on a beach in Adelaide, Australia, perfectly dressed in expensive clothing despite the summer heat, his body positioned as though he had deliberately arranged himself for discovery, and in his pocket was a scrap of paper bearing only the words Tamam Shud, a phrase from the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam that would lead investigators on a decades-long investigation that continues to this day without resolution. The man's face was striking enough to be memorable, yet no one in all of Adelaide could identify him, and despite fingerprints being sent to authorities across multiple countries, despite photographs being published in newspapers worldwide, despite every investigative technique available in that era being employed with determination and precision, the mystery of who this man was has remained impenetrably sealed. As though he had somehow existed in complete isolation from human society until the moment of his death. The psychological mechanism at work here is our desperate human need for narrative completion and identity, our fundamental inability to accept that someone could be utterly unknown, that a human being could live without documentation or connection, without ever being missed or sought or recognized by anyone who knew them, which creates a peculiar cognitive dissonance when confronted with the Somerton Man's absolute anonymity. What makes this case persist in our collective imagination across generations is precisely this unresolved tension between the specificity of his physical presence, the detail of his clothing and the exactness of his death, and the absolute void where his identity should be, a contradiction that our minds cannot adequately process or categorize, leaving us endlessly searching for patterns and connections in fragmentary evidence. In November of 1970, a woman's body was discovered burning on a mountainside in the Isdal Valley near Bergen, Norway, and what made her death so profoundly strange was not merely the circumstances of her death, but the complete and utter absence of any explanation for who she was or why she had come to that remote location. The body was found extensively burned, positioned in what seemed to be a deliberate arrangement, surrounded by various clothing items that had been carefully placed nearby rather than scattered as they would have been in a natural accident. And when investigators examined her remains, they discovered that she had consumed a lethal dose of prescription sedatives before the fire was set. The woman had no identification on her person, no passport, no papers of any kind, and despite exhaustive efforts to match her dental records and fingerprints against databases across Europe, she remained completely unidentified for decades, becoming known only as the Isdal Woman, a ghost in death just as she apparently had been in life. What makes this case psychologically unsettling is the unmistakable evidence of intentional preparation and methodical planning that surrounds every detail of her final moments. The placement of her belongings, the combination of sedatives and fire as a death method, and the selection of such an isolated location all suggest a person who had organized her own demise with remarkable precision. Yet the fundamental question of her identity raises the disturbing possibility that she was living an entirely hidden existence, moving through the world under false pretenses and constructed identities, leaving no trace of her true self in any official record or personal relationship that might have survived her. In 1933, during the depths of the Great Depression, when economic devastation had stripped millions of Americans of their livelihoods and dignity, the Bowman Manufacturing Company in Chicago faced a peculiar and unsettling labor uprising that revealed something deeply disturbing about human desperation and the mechanics of industrial control. The workers at this factory, already operating on poverty wages during a time when starvation was a genuine threat to working families, initiated a strike not over the conventional grievances of hours or pay, but over something far more psychologically invasive: the company's installation of a new speed-up system that fundamentally altered the pace at which workers could breathe and move throughout their shifts. The factory owners had implemented machinery and management techniques designed to extract maximum productivity from human bodies, creating rhythms of work that left employees physically exhausted and emotionally hollowed by day's end. Yet the strike itself was met with such industrial violence and legal suppression that it became a footnote in labor history rather than the watershed moment it deserved to be. What makes this incident particularly disturbing lies not in the dramatic confrontation itself, but in the psychological mechanism at its core. Workers discovered that they had been gradually acclimating to conditions that were literally shortening their lifespans, and the act of resistance required them to acknowledge how thoroughly they had normalized their own exploitation. The deeper disturbance emerges from how this pattern has persisted and evolved across a century of industrial development, as modern workplaces have simply made the acceleration invisible through digital metrics, productivity apps, and algorithmic scheduling rather than mechanical pace setters, meaning that contemporary workers often accept conditions equally punishing as those that sparked the Bowman Strike, yet with even less awareness that they are participating in their own gradual depletion. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and among the thousands of photographs and film footage captured that day, one mysterious figure has haunted researchers and conspiracy theorists for nearly 6 decades. A woman in a brown coat and a distinctive headscarf, known colloquially as the Babushka Lady. In the Zapruder film and numerous still photographs from the motorcade, this unidentified woman appears to be standing near the grassy knoll, the alleged location from which some theorists claim a second shooter fired upon the presidential limousine, and remarkably, she appears to be holding a camera or recording device throughout the entire shooting sequence. Despite intensive investigations by the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and countless independent researchers, the Babushka Lady has never been definitively identified, her film footage has never been recovered, and she has never come forward to explain her presence or her apparent documentation of the shooting. What makes this case psychologically compelling is that her visibility in plain sight, captured by multiple photographers, recorded on film, present in front of dozens of witnesses, paradoxically makes her disappearance more inexplicable. She is simultaneously the most documented and most elusive witness to one of the 20th century's most significant events. The logical mechanisms that would typically lead to identification have failed entirely. In an era before mass surveillance, but after the proliferation of photography, a woman who apparently filmed the assassination simply vanished, leaving behind only her ghostly image in the margins of history. Over the decades, numerous theories have emerged suggesting she was either a federal agent collecting evidence, a conspirator documenting the operation, or simply a curious tourist who never realized the historical significance of her presence. Yet each explanation contains logical inconsistencies that prevent certainty. In February of 1957, a cardboard box was discovered in the basement of an abandoned house in Philadelphia, and inside that box lay the mummified remains of a young boy, estimated to be between 3 and 4 years old, wrapped carefully in old newspapers and blankets, as though someone had taken great care in his placement. The child had been dead for several months, his body preserved by the dry conditions of the basement, and he wore only a pair of socks, his small frame curled within the confines of the box like a secret that someone had chosen to keep from the world. Despite extensive investigation and forensic examination, including fingerprint analysis and dental record searches conducted throughout the 1950s and beyond, the identity of the boy remained entirely unknown, and he was eventually buried under a gravestone that simply read, "America's Unknown Child," a designation that would haunt criminologists and amateur investigators for decades to come. The circumstances of his death suggested foul play, though the exact cause could not be definitively determined from the skeletal remains, and investigators theorized that the careful wrapping and placement indicated someone who had known the child, perhaps a family member, rather than a random act of violence. Yet this knowledge brought them no closer to understanding who he was or why he had been concealed in such a deliberate manner. What makes this case psychologically unsettling is not merely the death of a young child, tragic as that is, but rather the complete erasure of his existence from human record, the fact that a small human being could live, die, and be hidden away so thoroughly that no one ever reported him missing, that no family came forward, that he left behind no trace in any official capacity, suggesting a child so isolated and unknown that his absence created no ripples in the world around him. In the latter half of the 19th century, two of the most accomplished paleontologists in American history engaged in what would become one of the most bitter, vicious, and scientifically destructive rivalries ever recorded, a phenomenon that came to be known as the Bone Wars. Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh, both brilliant men with exceptional access to resources and influence, became locked in an escalating competition to discover and name the most dinosaur species, a rivalry that consumed decades of their lives and fundamentally altered how paleontology would develop as a discipline. What began as professional disagreement evolved into personal vendetta, with each man actively sabotaging the other's work, bribing fossil hunters to withhold specimens, and publishing deliberately misleading or incomplete research specifically designed to confuse their rivals' efforts and damage their reputation within the scientific community. The psychological mechanism driving this destructive behavior stemmed from a combination of ego, competitive ambition, and the genuine belief that priority of discovery granted the discoverer ultimate authority over naming and interpreting new species, which created an environment where every bone bed became a battleground and every fossil became currency in an economic system of prestige and academic dominance. Cope and Marsh would send competing teams to the same dig sites, occasionally resulting in physical confrontations, while simultaneously engaging in elaborate schemes involving false claims, stolen specimens, and publications designed to obscure rather than illuminate scientific truth. What makes this phenomenon particularly disturbing is how normalized this competitive destruction became within the emerging field of paleontology, with subsequent generations of scientists seemingly accepting that this sort of ruthless, self-serving behavior represented the natural state of scientific advancement rather than a profound corruption of scientific principles. In the arid basin of Xinjiang in northwestern China, where the Taklamakan Desert stretches endlessly beneath an unforgiving sun, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of remarkably well-preserved mummified remains dating back nearly 4,000 years. And these bodies tell a story that fundamentally challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient human migration and cultural exchange across Asia. The Tarim Basin, once a thriving crossroads of the ancient Silk Road, preserved these corpses in extraordinary condition due to its extreme dryness and the particular chemistry of the salt-laden soil, creating a natural mummification process that kept skin, hair, clothing, and even internal organs largely intact across millennia. What makes the discovery so profoundly unsettling is not merely the fact that these ancient peoples were preserved like photographs frozen in time, but rather that many of them display distinctly European or Indo-European physical characteristics, including reddish or blonde hair, fair skin, and facial features that seem wholly out of place in the geographical heart of Asia, suggesting a far more complex pattern of ancient human movement and interaction than conventional historical narratives had previously allowed. The psychological mechanism at work here stems from our deep-seated need to create tidy, linear stories about human history and cultural origins, compartmentalizing ancient civilizations into neat geographical and ethnic boxes that make sense within our modern frameworks of nationalism and identity. Yet the Tarim mummies refuse to conform to these comfortable boundaries, presenting us instead with evidence of interconnection, migration, and mixture occurring thousands of years before we typically acknowledge such possibilities, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable reality that ancient populations were far more mobile and cosmopolitan than we have been willing to accept. Scattered across the peat bogs of northern Europe, particularly in Ireland, Scotland, and Denmark, archaeologists have discovered the remarkably preserved remains of hundreds of human bodies dating back thousands of years, some as old as 8,000 years, their skin still bearing the texture and color of leather, their faces frozen in expressions that hint at their final moments. These bog bodies, as they are known, represent one of archaeology's most extraordinary windows into ancient human life, yet also one of its most unsettling, because many of these individuals did not simply die of natural causes and sink into the preserving peat by chance. The acidic conditions, low oxygen levels, and cool temperatures of bog environments created a natural mummification process so effective that skin, hair, organs, and even stomach contents remain intact after millennia, allowing modern forensic analysis to reveal details that would otherwise be lost to time. What emerges from this analysis is a deeply disturbing pattern, suggesting that many of these people were deliberately killed, their bodies arranged in ways that suggest ritualistic practices, sacrificial ceremonies, or executions related to ancient Celtic and Germanic tribal customs. Some bog bodies bear evidence of violent trauma, rope marks around the neck, stab wounds to the torso, or heads severed from their bodies, while others seem to have been placed into the bog as though positioned with ceremonial intent, their deaths perhaps serving purposes connected to fertility rites, punishment for transgressions, or offerings to deities. In 1991, two hikers traversing the Ötztal Alps between Austria and Italy stumbled upon something that would fundamentally challenge our understanding of prehistoric human existence and mortality itself. Protruding from the melting ice at over 10,000 feet in elevation was a human corpse, remarkably preserved by the frozen conditions that had maintained him for over 5,000 years. The man, subsequently named Otzi after the mountain valley where he was discovered, represented an unprecedented archaeological find, a window into the Bronze Age world that most of us could scarcely imagine. What made this discovery particularly unsettling, however, was not merely his age or his preservation, but rather the circumstances surrounding his death and the intimate details we could extract from his frozen remains. Modern analysis revealed that Otzi had been shot in the back with an arrow, the shaft of which remained embedded in his shoulder, and that he had subsequently fled into the mountains where he collapsed and died in the snow. His final moments, preserved in ice for millennia, showed a man in tremendous pain, covered in blood, desperately seeking shelter in an alpine cave where he would eventually succumb to his wound. The psychological mechanism that makes Otzi so deeply disturbing operates on a primal level, forcing us to confront the violent reality of human existence across vast stretches of time, to recognize that suffering and brutality are not modern inventions, but ancient constants woven into our species' fabric. We find ourselves inexplicably drawn to the specificity of his death, the knowledge that we can reconstruct his final hours with forensic precision, that his desperation and fear have been captured and preserved in a way that feels almost voyeuristic. Yet despite understanding intellectually that violence has always been part of human experience, we continue to treat such discoveries as shocking aberrations rather than the inevitable consequences of a species that has never fundamentally altered its capacity for causing harm. Beneath the streets of Paris lies one of history's most haunting burial grounds, a sprawling network of limestone quarries that was repurposed in the late 18th century to hold the remains of approximately 6 million people, creating what is essentially an underground city of the dead stretching for miles through the bedrock beneath one of the world's most beautiful and vibrant cities. When Paris faced a severe overcrowding crisis in its cemeteries, where bodies were literally piling up faster than they could be buried and disease was spreading through residential neighborhoods from the stench of decomposition, authorities made the practical decision to relocate millions of skeletal remains into these ancient quarries, transforming dark tunnels into macabre ossuaries where bones were carefully stacked and arranged into walls, creating decorative patterns with skulls and femurs that form an almost architectural testament to human mortality. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon emerges from our fundamental need to balance practical necessity with cultural taboo. The catacombs represent a solution to an impossible problem where society could acknowledge death while simultaneously containing it, pushing the reality of human mortality quite literally underground, where it could be forgotten in daylight hours. What makes the catacombs particularly disturbing is not merely that millions of remains exist in these passages, but that they have become normalized as a tourist attraction, where living people descend into tombs to walk among the carefully arranged skeletons of strangers, snapping photographs next to arrangements of skulls with the same casual attitude one might bring to visiting any other historical landmark. Beneath the Church of Santa Maria della Concesini in Rome lies one of Europe's most extraordinary and unsettling ossuaries, a subterranean chamber constructed almost entirely from human remains, where approximately 40,000 skeletal fragments have been meticulously arranged into elaborate decorative patterns that transform death itself into architectural ornamentation. The Capuchin friars who created this macabre catacomb beginning in the 1600s were not driven by malice or desecration, but rather by a practical crisis of space combined with a deeply sincere theological conviction that surrounding themselves with the physical evidence of mortality would serve as a constant memento mori, a meditation on the transience of life and the ultimate futility of earthly vanity. The walls are fashioned from femurs and vertebrae, the arches constructed from rib cages, and elaborate chandeliers and rosettes are fashioned from finger bones and cranial fragments, each piece positioned with deliberate precision to create ornaments of undeniable aesthetic sophistication, yet the overall effect remains profoundly disorienting and psychologically overwhelming, as if the entire space conspires to dissolve the boundary between art and horror. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the human mind's struggle to reconcile beauty with decay, order with chaos, and the sacred with the grotesque, creating a cognitive dissonance that leaves visitors both mesmerized and deeply unsettled, as though witnessing a visual argument that spirituality and decomposition need not be mutually exclusive. In a small chapel beneath the Church of All Saints in the Czech Republic lies one of Europe's most unsettling repositories of human mortality, a space where the boundary between sacred reverence and macabre artistry blurs into something that defies simple categorization. The Sedlec Ossuary contains the skeletal remains of approximately 40 to 70,000 people, though the exact number remains unknown, stacked, arranged, and fashioned into elaborate decorative structures that line the walls and ceiling of this underground chamber. The bones form chandeliers that hang like frozen sculptures of death, pyramids that reach toward the vault, and coat of arms displays that memorialize noble families, all constructed with meticulous attention to aesthetic detail that transforms what might otherwise be a mass grave into something approaching an art installation. During the 1400s, a plague swept through the region and killed vast numbers of people, overwhelming the burial capacity of the local cemetery, and when later centuries brought additional deaths from war and disease, the need to manage human remains in limited space created a practical problem that would eventually become this extraordinary monument to mortality itself. The psychological mechanism underlying the Sedlec Ossuary reflects a fundamental human struggle with the reality of death and the search for meaning in the face of overwhelming loss, where bone arrangement becomes a form of control, a way of imposing order and even beauty upon the chaos of mass mortality. By transforming remains into deliberate artistic compositions, the monks and caretakers who maintained this space engaged in a kind of ritual sublimation, channeling the anxiety of death into careful curation, essentially saying that human remains need not be hidden away in shame, but could instead be acknowledged, arranged, and even celebrated as part of our shared human condition. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, the sprawling capital of the Aztec Empire, there existed a structure of haunting architectural purpose known as the Tzompantli, or skull rack, a towering wooden framework designed specifically to display the severed heads of sacrificial victims in organized, methodical rows that could number in the thousands. Spanish conquistadors who witnessed these installations during their conquest of Mexico in the 16th century reported with visible horror at the sight of countless human skulls impaled upon long wooden poles, arranged with such precision and care that the structure became less a monument to chaos and more a deliberate, calculated statement of power and religious devotion. The Tzompantli was not hidden away or kept secret, but rather positioned prominently in the sacred ceremonial center of Aztec cities, visible to the general population, serving as a constant reminder of the civilization's relationship with death, sacrifice, and the cosmic order they believed their rituals maintained. Archaeological evidence, including foundation remains and detailed Spanish accounts, suggests these racks were substantial structures, some capable of holding 10,000 or more skulls, rebuilt and expanded over generations as the practice continued through centuries. The Aztec people did not view these displays as barbaric aberrations, but rather as essential religious infrastructure, as crucial to their spiritual worldview as temples or altars, the visible manifestation of a belief system that understood human sacrifice as the literal fuel required to keep the sun moving across the sky and prevent cosmic catastrophe. What emerges from study of this practice is not so much the capacity for human cruelty, which exists across all cultures, but rather the remarkable psychological mechanism by which an entire civilization could normalize and institutionalize an otherwise unfathomable practice, integrating it so thoroughly into religious doctrine and cosmological belief that mass death became not merely acceptable but morally necessary and spiritually celebrated. Beneath the earthen mounds of Cahokia, one of North America's most sophisticated pre-Columbian cities, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of mass death on a scale that challenges our understanding of ancient civilization. Located near present-day St. Louis, Illinois, the site reveals that around the year 1200, during the height of Cahokian prosperity, dozens of individuals were systematically placed into mass graves with little ceremony or care, their bodies arranged in patterns suggesting coordinated burial events rather than natural mortality. In one particularly striking discovery, a grave designated Mound 72 revealed the remains of a high-status individual surrounded by thousands of shell beads, surrounded in turn by the remains of nearly 300 other people, many of whom appear to have been ritually sacrificed, their bodies positioned and oriented in ways that indicate deliberate, organized killing events. The skeletal evidence shows evidence of trauma, disease, and what researchers interpret as execution, with some bodies showing signs of decapitation or having been dismembered before burial. What makes this discovery psychologically unsettling is not simply that mass death occurred, but that it appears to have been institutionalized within a flourishing society, suggesting that ritual human sacrifice may have been a normative practice woven into the religious and political fabric of Cahokian leadership during its final centuries. The mechanism driving such practices likely emerged from a complex interplay of environmental stress, hierarchical religious ideology, and the consolidation of political power through supernatural authority, wherein priests and rulers reinforced their dominance by demonstrating control over life itself. Yet what persists as disturbing is how easily we tend to relegate such practices to the distant past as aberrations of primitive thinking, when in reality, the impulse to ritualize killing and death through institutional structures has remained remarkably consistent throughout human history, merely changing its cultural and ideological justifications across time. In the ancient Egyptian city of Avaris, during excavations in the early 2000s, archaeologists uncovered something that fundamentally challenged our understanding of ancient religious practice and human sacrifice. Beneath the floors of what appeared to be royal administrative buildings, they discovered numerous deep pits containing the severed hands of young men, carefully arranged and preserved with a ritualistic precision that suggested deliberate intention rather than the chaotic byproduct of warfare. These hands, numbering in the dozens across multiple pit sites, had been interred with the kind of ceremonial care typically reserved for objects of profound spiritual significance, wrapped in linen and placed in specific geometric patterns that indicated careful planning and execution. The hands belonged to individuals who appeared to be between 15 and 20 years of age, their bones showing signs of being deliberately severed at the wrist with stone or bronze implements, the cuts clean and purposeful rather than ragged or accidental. Archaeologists theorized that these may have represented a form of tribute system or victory ritual where conquered enemies or sacrificial victims were dispatched in a controlled setting, with their hands collected as proof of conquest or as offerings to the divine. The psychological mechanism underlying such a practice likely stemmed from a combination of practical bureaucratic accounting and deeply held religious conviction, where the hand became a symbolic representation of the individual and their labor, their power, or their transgression against cosmic order. What remains disturbing is how completely normalized this practice appears to have been within Avaris's society, evidenced by the architectural integration of these pits into everyday administrative spaces, suggesting that generations of inhabitants walked above these burial sites without apparent moral or spiritual disturbance, their collective cultural values so fundamentally different from our own that we can only reconstruct their logic through fragmentary evidence and educated speculation. High in the Indian Himalayas, at an elevation of roughly 16,000 feet above sea level, there exists a glacial lake that contains the remains of hundreds of human skeletons scattered across its frozen surface and embedded within its ice. A discovery that was made in 1942 when Indian officials first encountered what appeared to be the decomposed remnants of an entire population frozen in time. The skeletons, numbering somewhere between 300 and 600 individuals, were found in remarkably well-preserved states, their bones bleached white by decades of alpine sun, yet still arranged in positions that suggested they had been caught in some catastrophic event that left them stranded at this impossible altitude. Investigation and subsequent carbon dating revealed that these deaths did not occur in a single incident, but rather across multiple time periods, with some remains dating back to the 9th century, while others were found to be only a few centuries old, suggesting that Rupkund Lake became, over time, a repository for human tragedy on an almost incomprehensible scale. The leading theory, supported by skeletal analysis and historical records, suggests that many of these individuals perished during intense hailstorms that swept across the mountain pass where the lake sits, sudden and brutal weather events that would have left travelers with no shelter, no escape, and no chance of survival in temperatures that plummeted far below freezing. The psychological power of Rupkund Lake lies in its ability to strip away our sense of control and safety in nature, to reveal how quickly human bodies can be discarded by the environment, how a place of natural beauty can simultaneously become a mass grave where the rules of civilization and burial customs simply cease to exist. In the Xiang Quang Plateau of northern Laos, scattered across a vast expanse of remote countryside, there exists one of archaeology's most perplexing enigmas. Thousands upon thousands of massive stone jars, some standing as tall as a person, arranged in seemingly deliberate patterns across the landscape with no clear explanation for their purpose or origin. These vessels, which have come to be known collectively as the Plain of Jars, date back somewhere between 500 and 2,500 years, their exact age debated fiercely among scholars who have attempted to unravel their mystery. The jars themselves are carved from solid stone, each one requiring enormous effort to extract, shape, and position, yet their function remains almost entirely unknown, shrouded in speculation ranging from ancient burial vessels to ceremonial containers to grain storage for forgotten civilizations. What makes this discovery particularly unsettling is not merely the jars themselves, but rather the profound sense of displacement they inspire when standing among them, confronted with irrefutable evidence that an entire culture devoted tremendous resources to creating thousands of identical stone objects whose purpose has been completely erased from human knowledge. The psychological unease stems from this fundamental gap between the obvious intentionality of the work and the absolute absence of any reliable explanation for that intention, creating a void where understanding should exist. Archaeological expeditions have yielded few definitive answers, with theories ranging wildly in credibility and supporting evidence, leaving visitors with a landscape that feels almost deliberately cryptic, as if the ancient people who created it ensured that their true meaning would never be recovered. This ambiguity persists despite decades of study and investigation, perhaps because the culture that built the Plain of Jars left behind almost no written records, no oral traditions, and no secondary sources that might illuminate their motivations. Scattered across the Diquis Delta region of Costa Rica, in the dense jungle landscape where the borders of that nation meet the Pacific Ocean, lie hundreds of perfectly spherical stones, some as small as a tennis ball and others reaching up to 7 feet in diameter, weighing as much as 16 tons, their surfaces so uniformly rounded and polished that they appear almost impossibly artificial, yet they have persisted in this landscape for centuries. Their true origins remaining one of archaeology's most genuine unsolved mysteries. These stone spheres were first brought to widespread attention in the 1930s when workers clearing jungle land for banana plantations began uncovering them systematically. And what struck those early discoverers was not merely their existence, but their geometric perfection. The way each one seemed mathematically precise despite their varying sizes, arranged in patterns and groupings that suggested intentional placement rather than natural geological formation. The Baruka and Tairaba indigenous peoples who inhabit the region possess no clear oral traditions explaining the spheres, offering no definitive timeline or purpose, and archaeological evidence suggests they were created sometime between 2,500 and 1,500 years ago, yet no one has successfully determined with certainty who made them, what tools were used to achieve such flawless spherical geometry, or what cultural or religious function they served in their original context. Deep within the Egyptian Museum in Cairo rests a wooden artifact that has perplexed archaeologists and historians for generations, a small carved object discovered in the Saqqara necropolis that resembles, with unsettling precision, a modern aircraft. Excavated in the 1920s from the tomb of Khentiamentiu, a high-ranking official of the Middle Kingdom, this palmwood sculpture measures merely 7.5 inches in length, yet its aerodynamic form defies conventional explanation for an object created roughly 4,000 years ago. The wings are perfectly symmetrical, the fuselage tapers with elegant proportions, and the tail structure bears striking resemblance to the vertical and horizontal stabilizers found on contemporary airplanes, features that seem impossibly sophisticated for a civilization traditionally understood to have created only basic wooden toys and religious objects. The psychological mechanism driving our fascination with this artifact stems from a deeply human compulsion to recognize patterns and impose meaning upon ambiguous evidence, a cognitive tendency that becomes particularly acute when confronted with objects that challenge our understanding of technological progress and ancient capability. When we encounter something that appears to bridge the gap between ancient civilization and modern innovation, our minds scramble to construct narratives that either explain away the resemblance through mundane purposes like bird-shaped amulets or toys, or alternatively embrace more extraordinary interpretations involving lost advanced knowledge or extraterrestrial contact. What remains genuinely disturbing about the Saqqara bird is how readily we have normalized the uncertainty surrounding its purpose despite possessing no definitive evidence of its actual function, how institutional archaeology has settled upon the bird hypothesis with minimal supporting documentation, and how the artifact has transcended into popular culture as either pseudo-archaeological proof of ancient aviation or conveniently dismissed as irrelevant sculptural coincidence, depending on one's inclination toward unconventional history. In the year 1936, archaeologists working near the ancient city of Baghdad uncovered something that should not have existed according to everything we thought we knew about the timeline of human technological advancement. A small clay jar containing a copper cylinder nested inside an iron rod, with the space between them filled with a bituminous material that seemed to serve no obvious decorative purpose. The object, no more than a few inches tall, dated back approximately 2,000 years to the Parthian Empire, and when researchers conducted experiments by filling similar reconstructed vessels with acidic substances like vinegar or lemon juice, they produced a measurable electrical current, suggesting that ancient peoples may have possessed the ability to generate electricity through a rudimentary battery. Long before Alessandro, Volta would be credited with inventing the galvanic cell in the 18th century. The discovery triggered immediate scientific fascination and equally immediate skepticism, as the very premise challenged the narrative of linear technological progress that had defined our understanding of ancient civilizations, suggesting that knowledge could be lost, that capability could vanish, that a society could develop something useful and then abandon it entirely, leaving only enigmatic artifacts for future generations to puzzle over in bewilderment. What makes the Baghdad Battery persistently disturbing is not merely the object itself, but what it represents. The unsettling possibility that our historical record is incomplete, that civilizations before us achieved things we cannot fully explain, and perhaps more troubling still, that we may never know their intended purpose or understand why such knowledge was not preserved and built upon. Imagine the moment in 1900 when Greek sponge divers working off the coast of the island of Antikythera discovered the corroded remains of an ancient shipwreck, and among the usual pottery and statues, they found something that should not have existed according to everything we thought we knew about ancient civilizations. A complex bronze device covered in gears and inscriptions, roughly the size of a shoebox, that appeared to be an astronomical calculator of extraordinary sophistication. The mechanism contained at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, each precisely cut with teeth, arranged in a system so intricate and purposeful that it seemed to belong to the 19th century, not the 1st century before Christ, yet the dating was undeniable. This object, which we now call the Antikythera Mechanism, represented a technological achievement so advanced that nothing comparable would appear in human history for another 1,000 years, and its very existence challenged our fundamental understanding of ancient human capability and knowledge. The psychological disturbance this artifact creates stems from the profound temporal displacement it represents. Here is evidence that ancient peoples possessed mechanical knowledge, mathematical precision, and engineering sophistication that we had assigned exclusively to the modern era, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable reality that civilizations can possess remarkable achievements and then lose them completely, leaving only fragments and questions. We built our historical narrative assuming a linear progression of technology and knowledge, where each century built upon the last in an orderly march towards sophistication, yet the Antikythera Mechanism violently contradicts this assumption by suggesting that knowledge can exist, flourish, and then vanish without trace, that entire technological traditions can be lost to history, that what we consider modern innovation may simply be the rediscovery of forgotten wisdom. In the arid Nazca region of Peru, where the earth stretches flat beneath an unforgiving sun and rainfall is virtually non-existent, archaeologists have discovered an extraordinary collection of preserved human remains dating back over 2,000 years. These Nazca mummies represent some of the most intact pre-Columbian bodies ever found, their preservation so complete that skin, hair, textiles, and internal organs remain visible to the modern eye, as if the individuals had merely fallen asleep centuries ago rather than having experienced death. The desiccating climate of the Nazca Plateau, combined with specific burial practices that sealed bodies within carefully constructed tombs surrounded by grave goods and ceremonial objects, created perfect conditions for natural mummification without the intentional embalming techniques associated with Egyptian mummies. What makes these discoveries particularly unsettling is the extraordinary detail with which we can now observe the dead. We see the delicate features of their faces, the intricate tattoos and body modifications adorning their skin, the positions in which they chose or were forced to rest, and sometimes even the final meals still present within their preserved digestive systems. The psychological discomfort derives partly from how these mummies collapse the distance between ourselves and ancient death, presenting us with an almost photographic documentation of human mortality that feels uncomfortably intimate and real. Yet despite understanding the scientific explanations behind their preservation, and despite the intellectual framework we use to contextualize them as archaeological artifacts worthy of study and preservation, we continue to maintain these remains in museums and continue to display them to the public, perpetuating a phenomenon wherein the dead remain perpetually available for observation and scrutiny. Their final autonomy surrendered to our collective curiosity and our museum's endless hunger for objects that teach us about the past. In the arid desert regions of southern Peru, approximately 75 miles south of the city of Lima, lies the Paracas Peninsula, a windswept expanse of sand and rock that has yielded one of archaeology's most enigmatic discoveries. Beginning in 1920 and continuing through subsequent excavations, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of elongated human skulls buried within the ancient Paracas necropolis, dating back roughly 2,500 years to a pre-Incan civilization that flourished along Peru's coast. These skulls possessed cranial proportions so dramatically different from modern human anatomy that their existence has perpetually defied straightforward explanation, featuring elongated dome shapes with significantly increased cranial capacity, thicker bone density, and structural characteristics that appear fundamentally inconsistent with known patterns of human cranial deformation. The initial scientific interpretation proposed that these skulls resulted from artificial cranial modification, a cultural practice documented across numerous ancient civilizations where infants' malleable skulls were bound tightly with cloth or wooden devices to create aesthetic or status-signifying shapes. Yet the Paracas specimens exhibited bone thickness and structural properties that standard deformation techniques could not fully account for, creating persistent anatomical anomalies that resisted conventional anthropological frameworks. This discrepancy between observable physical evidence and established scientific understanding birthed a vacuum of certainty that human imagination has eagerly colonized, spawning decades of speculation regarding extraterrestrial ancestry, lost advanced civilizations, or genetic engineering by unknown prehistoric forces. In 1999, a couple hiking through the Sonoran Desert near Mexico discovered a skeletal remains partially exposed in the sandy soil, and among the bones was a peculiar skull that would eventually become known as the Starchild Skull, named after a book by Lloyd Pye who championed its study and promoted the theory that it represented an extraterrestrial or extraterrestrial human hybrid entity. The skull itself possesses several unusual characteristics that depart from typical human anatomy, including an elongated cranium with a pronounced slope to the back of the head, eye sockets that are larger and more widely set than normal human proportions, and a missing lower jaw that was never recovered, along with an overall thickness and density to the bone that seemed to exceed standard human skeletal material. Various amateur researchers and proponents of the theory have pointed to these morphological differences as evidence of non-human origin, suggesting that radiometric dating placed the remains between 600 to 2,000 years old, though this dating itself became contested in scientific circles. The psychological mechanism driving the persistence of this theory rests fundamentally on our deep-seated fascination with the possibility of extraterrestrial contact and our tendency to interpret ambiguous physical evidence through the lens of our desires and expectations rather than through rigorous comparative analysis. When we encounter something that appears unusual or doesn't immediately conform to our understanding of human variation, there exists a powerful cognitive bias towards supernatural or extraordinary explanations, particularly when a compelling narrative or charismatic advocate presents the alternative hypothesis with enough conviction and detail. In 1945, in the small Mexican town of Acambaro in the state of Guanajuato, a man named Waldemar Julsrud began excavating clay figurines from the earth beneath his property, ultimately uncovering thousands of small ceramic objects depicting creatures and scenes that seemed to defy conventional archaeological understanding. These figurines, which became known as the Acambaro Figures, portrayed what appeared to be dinosaurs alongside human figures, complete with detailed anatomical features and expressive characteristics that suggested the artist possessed intimate knowledge of creatures that had been extinct for millions of years before human civilization could have possibly emerged. The figures ranged from a few inches to several feet in height, displaying remarkable craftsmanship and depicting scenarios that included what many observers interpreted as interactions between humans and prehistoric reptilian creatures, a proposition that directly contradicted the established timeline of human existence and paleontological knowledge. The psychological appeal of these objects lies in their ability to suggest an alternative human history, one in which our ancestors somehow coexisted with dinosaurs or possessed knowledge of their appearance transmitted through some unknown mechanism, tapping into a deep human desire to discover that our understanding of the past contains fundamental errors or omissions. This desire becomes particularly compelling because the figurines were made with genuine archaeological skill and appeared to come from genuine subsurface deposits, creating an aura of legitimacy that mainstream scientists struggled to adequately dispel without simply dismissing the objects outright. In the remote mountains of Tibet, during an expedition in the 1930s, a Chinese archaeologist named Kai Pute allegedly discovered a series of stone discs buried within a vast network of caves, and these artifacts, which became known as the Dropa Stones, were said to contain intricate spiral grooves that resembled an ancient form of writing, with each disc measuring roughly 10 inches in diameter and featuring a hole in the center, and according to the account. These stones were accompanied by the skeletal remains of small humanoid creatures standing only about 4 feet tall, leading to extraordinary claims that extraterrestrial beings had visited Earth thousands of years ago and left behind these crystalline records as evidence of their presence. The narrative surrounding these artifacts suggests that the grooves on the stones contain a complete chronicle of the Dropa civilization, describing their arrival on Earth and their interactions with the indigenous human population. Yet remarkably, no credible photographs of these original stones have ever been produced, and scholars point out that the entire documented history of the discovery relies almost exclusively on accounts circulated decades after the supposed excavation. With no contemporary scientific verification or peer-reviewed documentation emerging from the supposed find. What makes the Dropa stones particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is how they persist in popular consciousness despite lacking even basic archaeological evidence, revealing our persistent hunger for evidence that we are not alone in the universe, a need so profound that we are willing to embrace explanations that contradict established scientific methodology. And the narrative surrounding them transforms what should be extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence into folklore that spreads through documentary entertainment, podcasts, and social media platforms without significant scrutiny. In the early 16th century, a Turkish cartographer and military intelligence officer named Piri Reis created what would become one of history's most enigmatic and contested maps, a document that would eventually fuel centuries of speculation, conspiracy theories, and profound questions about the limits of ancient knowledge. The map itself, discovered in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul in 1931, depicts portions of the Mediterranean, parts of Europe, Africa, and crucially, what appears to be the eastern coast of South America with startling geographical accuracy, along with depictions of regions including Antarctica, centuries before the continent's official discovery by modern explorers. Piri Reis compiled this map using source materials available to him, including navigational charts from Columbus and other period explorers, Ottoman imperial records, and potentially ancient cartographic documents. Yet the precision with which certain landmasses are rendered has prompted serious researchers and pseudoscientific speculators alike to wonder whether his sources contained knowledge far older than conventionally accepted. The psychological appeal of the Piri Reis map operates on multiple levels simultaneously, beginning with humanity's deep fascination with hidden knowledge and the possibility that advanced civilizations possessed capabilities we attribute only to modernity, a narrative that transforms a historical artifact into evidence of lost sophistication and forgotten wisdom. The map becomes psychologically compelling because it exists in an ambiguous space where reasonable historical scholarship and speculative fringe theories can both claim partial validity, allowing observers to project their beliefs about human potential and ancient civilizations onto its faded lines and notations. In 1958, a map surfaced in Europe that seemed to rewrite the history of exploration itself, purporting to show the North American coastline with remarkable accuracy centuries before Columbus, labeled with the mysterious name Vinland, a place that Norse sagas had spoken of in hushed, uncertain tones for 1,000 years. The map appeared in the hands of a dealer in rare manuscripts who claimed it had been bound together with a medieval text describing papal history, and its emergence sent shockwaves through the academic world because if authentic, it would definitively prove that Vikings had reached the Americas around the year 1000, fundamentally challenging the established narrative of European discovery that had been taught in schools and celebrated in popular culture for generations. What made the Vinland Map so deeply unsettling was not merely its potential to overturn historical understanding, but the profound uncertainty that surrounded its very existence, the way scholars invested tremendous professional credibility into validating or debunking it, the careers that were built or destroyed on its authentication, the circular reasoning that emerged as institutions committed themselves to proving or disproving a single object's legitimacy. The mechanism underlying this disturbance lies in how we construct historical truth around singular artifacts, how we grant objects the power to redefine everything we thought we knew, and how this places enormous psychological weight on the verification process itself, creating incentives for self-deception, confirmation bias, and the selective interpretation of evidence to support the conclusion we desperately want to reach. Deep within the vaults of the Swedish National Library in Stockholm rests one of history's most imposing and unsettling manuscripts, a tome so massive and extraordinarily dark that medieval monks believed only the devil himself could have inspired its creation. The Codex Gigas, known colloquially as the Devil's Bible, is a medieval illuminated manuscript measuring roughly 20 inches by 16 inches, weighing approximately 75 pounds, and containing nearly 300 parchment pages made from the skins of 170 donkeys. What makes this particular book genuinely disturbing is not merely its size or weight, but rather the full-page illustration contained within its pages depicting a grotesque, demonic figure of such haunting detail and malevolent presence that viewers across centuries have felt compelled to attribute its creation to supernatural forces rather than human artistry. The legend claims that a 13th-century Benedictine monk named Hermann the Recluse was sentenced to death for violating his monastic vows, and as punishment, he was given an impossible task: to create a complete and perfect book containing the entire Bible, medical texts, historical chronicles, and exorcism prayers, all within a single night. According to the mythology, Hermann made a dark bargain with the devil himself, trading his soul for the supernatural ability to complete this seemingly impossible work before dawn, and in gratitude, or perhaps as payment, he illustrated that unsettling image of the devil directly into the manuscript's pages. The psychological mechanism underlying humanity's attraction to this narrative reveals something profound about how we process inexplicable phenomena and human achievement. When confronted with something that appears to exceed normal human capability or contains elements of unusual darkness, we unconsciously search for supernatural explanations rather than accepting the simpler truth that humans are simply capable of extraordinary dedication, obsession, and artistic expression, even when twisted by desperation or institutional cruelty. Deep within the British Library, preserved in carefully controlled conditions, exists a medieval manuscript that represents one of the most haunting attempts to decode the secrets of transformation and mortality that human civilization has ever produced. The Ripley Scroll, attributed to the alchemist George Ripley in the 15th century, is not a simple text, but rather a visual and written guide to the great work of alchemy, a pursuit that consumed centuries of human effort and intellect in the quest to transmute base metals into gold and, more disturbingly, to achieve immortality itself. The scroll contains elaborate illustrations depicting grotesque hybrid creatures, suffering human figures, distorted anatomical forms, and symbolic representations of alchemical processes that were meant to unlock the fundamental nature of reality and the human condition. What makes this particular artifact so deeply unsettling is not merely its disturbing imagery, though the depictions of mutilation, dissolution, and transformation are certainly nightmarish in their execution, but rather what it represents about the human capacity for obsession with defying natural limits. The Ripley Scroll emerged from a culture entirely convinced that with enough knowledge, dedication, and proper technique, one could fundamentally alter the laws of nature itself. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system reveals a profound human terror of mortality and limitation, a desperate grasping for control over the uncontrollable forces of time and decay that defines our existence. The alchemists viewed the material world as malleable, corruptible, and ultimately perfectible through systematic application of knowledge and will, projecting their anxieties about death and transformation onto the material realm. Deep within the vaults of the National Library of Sweden rests one of the largest and most enigmatic medieval manuscripts ever created, a tome so massive and so deliberately peculiar that it has earned the nickname the Devil's Bible, a designation that emerges not from religious hyperbole, but from the disturbing historical circumstances surrounding its creation and the singular image contained within its yellowed pages. The Codex Gigas measures nearly 3 feet tall and weighs approximately 75 pounds, constructed from what scholars believe to be the stretched skin of approximately 160 donkeys, assembled into a single bound volume that required the lifetime effort of at least one monk working in the early 13th century within a Bohemian monastery, though the true identity of this monastic scribe remains lost to history. What makes this manuscript genuinely unsettling is not merely its massive proportions or the staggering expenditure of resources required for its creation, but rather the full-page illustration that appears within its pages, a portrait of the devil himself rendered in vivid red pigments with a grotesque, haunting expression that seems to confront the viewer with an intensity that transcends the merely artistic. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with this object stems from our deep discomfort with extremism in any form, whether that extremism manifests as the monk's obsessive commitment to creating something so monumentally impractical and laborious, or in the deliberate choice to immortalize evil in such elaborate detail within a religious text, a contradiction that should logically cancel itself out, but instead creates a profound cognitive dissonance. In the 1880s, a man named James B. Ward published a pamphlet containing 3 encrypted messages allegedly written by a man named Thomas Jefferson Beale in the early 1820s, claiming that Beale had buried an enormous treasure worth millions of dollars somewhere in Virginia and left behind 3 ciphers as the only means to locate it. Ward claimed he had decrypted one of the 3 ciphers, which supposedly revealed the location of the treasure in vague geographical terms, though the exact spot remained maddeningly unclear even after decryption. The second cipher was said to contain a detailed inventory of the treasure itself, and the third was meant to identify the rightful heirs. Yet despite nearly 2 centuries of effort from thousands of amateur cryptographers and professional code breakers, only the second cipher has ever been successfully decrypted, and it uses the Declaration of Independence as a key, a fact that itself raises profound questions about the authenticity of the entire enterprise. What makes the Beale ciphers so psychologically unsettling is not merely the mystery itself, but rather the way the mystery has persisted and intensified precisely because of its resistance to solution, creating a self-perpetuating cycle where each failed decryption attempt serves as evidence that the treasure must be real and waiting, that the cipher must contain genuine secrets worthy of protection, that the effort expended must eventually yield results. The obsessive pursuit has transformed the ciphers from a simple historical curiosity into something far more disturbing. A cultural phenomenon where rational people have devoted lifetimes to solving what many historians now believe may be an elaborate hoax or a merely invented story, yet the possibility that it might be real prevents the pursuit from ever truly ending. Nestled in the courtyard of the Central Intelligence Agency headquarters in Langley, Virginia, stands a copper sculpture that has captivated and frustrated cryptographers, intelligence professionals, and amateur code breakers for more than 3 decades. Created by artist Jim Sanborn and installed in 1990, the crypto's sculpture is a seemingly elegant arrangement of curved copper plates adorned with encrypted text, mysterious symbols, and layered messages that appear to hold secrets within secrets. The sculpture itself is visually striking, composed of 4 sections that resemble pages or sheets, with the largest piece featuring a prominent keyhole-shaped aperture that draws the eye toward its center, while simultaneously suggesting that something essential remains hidden from view. The encrypted text that covers these surfaces contains approximately 90 characters of seemingly random letters, yet within this chaos lies a structure that took decades to fully decrypt, and even now, portions of it remain controversial in their interpretation or possibly still concealed beneath multiple layers of encryption. The psychological mechanism behind the crypto sculpture's enduring fascination lies in humanity's fundamental compulsion to solve puzzles and uncover hidden meanings, particularly when those puzzles are associated with an institution as enigmatic and secretive as the CIA itself. The sculpture functions as a tangible representation of classified information and national security, transforming abstract concepts of secrecy into something physical that the public can engage with directly, even though most of that engagement involves frustrated attempts to breach barriers that were intentionally designed to resist penetration. This creates a peculiar psychological tension where the sculpture simultaneously invites investigation while ensuring that investigation will largely prove futile, tapping into our deep-seated desire to access forbidden knowledge and our frustration when faced with insurmountable barriers to understanding. Between 1968 and 1970, a serial killer operating in Northern California sent a series of letters and postcards to local newspapers and media outlets, each one crafted with meticulous precision and accompanied by cryptic symbols, ciphers, and claims of responsibility for murders that would eventually be attributed to an individual known only as the Zodiac Killer. These communications became increasingly theatrical and bizarre, featuring bizarre astrological symbols mixed with seemingly random ciphers, taunts directed at police investigators, and an almost performance art quality to the killer's correspondence that suggested he was not merely committing crimes, but orchestrating an extended entertainment directed at the public consciousness itself. What made these letters truly disturbing was not simply their content, but the way they introduced an element of direct interaction between murderer and society, transforming the investigative process into something resembling a dialogue or even a game with specific rules that only the killer seemed to fully understand. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior reveals something fundamentally unsettling about certain criminal minds: the need to transcend the act of killing itself and achieve a kind of immortality through communication, through forcing the world to acknowledge their existence and intellect through written words rather than bodies alone. By controlling the narrative through letters, by presenting puzzles that might never be solved, the killer extended his influence far beyond each individual victim, creating a persistent haunting presence in the cultural consciousness that has lasted now for more than 5 decades. The black-eyed children phenomenon began appearing in internet forums and paranormal communities around the year 2000, originating from a single post on a paranormal message board that described an unsettling encounter with children who possessed entirely black eyes, devoid of any visible iris or sclera, appearing at someone's door late at night and requesting entry in a peculiar, formal manner. The initial account claimed that these entities exhibited an unusual politeness and persistence, speaking in oddly sophisticated language, while their completely darkened eyes seemed to reflect nothing but emptiness. And since that first account was shared online, thousands of similar reports have emerged from across the globe, each describing nearly identical experiences where people encounter these children late at night, often at their homes, and feel an inexplicable compulsion to let them inside, despite an overwhelming sense of dread and wrongness that permeates the entire encounter. What makes these accounts psychologically fascinating is the consistency of the narrative structure across reports submitted by people who claim to have no prior knowledge of other accounts, suggesting either a genuine phenomenon that manifests in similar ways across different observers, or a shared archetypal image that has embedded itself in our collective consciousness through internet culture and has become a sort of modern folklore that spreads through suggestion and the human mind's natural tendency to recognize patterns and fill gaps in perception with recognizable templates. In 2 separate incidents occurring in the early 2010s, young girls in the United States attempted to murder their peers in the name of a fictional internet entity known as Slender Man, a tall, featureless figure that originated from a creepypasta horror forum and subsequently spread across the web as a meme and shared fictional universe. The first incident occurred in Wisconsin in 2012, when 2 12-year-old girls lured a classmate into the woods and stabbed her 19 times, believing they needed to prove their loyalty to Slender Man and appease his alleged influence over their lives. The second case unfolded in Florida in 2014, when another girl attempted to murder her friend by setting their home on fire, also citing Slender Man as her motivation and justification. What makes these cases particularly unsettling is not merely the violence itself, but rather the mechanism by which fictional storytelling and internet culture successfully merged with susceptible adolescent psychology to create a shared delusion capable of manifesting in genuinely dangerous behavior. The girls involved had spent considerable time immersed in online communities dedicated to Slender Man mythology, consuming user-generated fiction, artwork, and discussion forums that reinforced the figure's supposed reality and power, gradually blurring the distinction between creative entertainment and actual belief. This phenomenon reveals something profound about how narrative structures, group reinforcement, and the architecture of online spaces can rewire perception in developing brains, allowing fiction to metastasize into conviction with terrifying efficiency. In the winter of 1846 and 1847, a wagon train of American settlers became trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains after taking a poorly advised shortcut across the Great Salt Lake Desert, a decision that would transform their journey into one of history's most haunting chronicles of human desperation and survival. The group, consisting of approximately 90 people including families with young children, found themselves stranded at an elevation of over 6,000 feet as early and severe snowstorms descended upon them with relentless intensity, cutting off all routes of escape and any possibility of receiving supplies or assistance from the valleys below. As weeks turned into months and their carefully rationed food supplies dwindled to nothing, the members of the Donner Party faced an impossible choice that would force them to confront the most fundamental instinct of human nature: the desperate will to survive at any cost. They began to consume the hides of oxen, boiling leather, until it became a gelatinous substance barely capable of sustaining life. And when even that ran out, they turned to the only remaining source of nutrition available to them, a decision that would haunt the historical record and the descendants of those who survived. More than half of the 87 people who remained alive by winter's end did not live to see spring, succumbing to starvation and cold, while those who did survive carried with them the psychological weight of having consumed the remains of their companions, parents, spouses, and children. What makes the Donner Party persistently disturbing is not merely the fact of their cannibalism, but the way in which it was documented, discussed, and eventually sensationalized by the newspapers and accounts of the era, transforming individual tragedy into public spectacle and moral judgment. On October 13, 1972, Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 crashed into the Andes Mountains, leaving 45 people stranded at over 12,000 feet in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, where temperatures plummeted far below freezing each night and rescue seemed impossibly distant. The survivors faced a catastrophic situation that forced them into impossible choices. Their food supplies were minimal, the terrain was barren and desolate, and rescue operations had been called off as authorities assumed no one could have survived the initial impact. For weeks, these men endured starvation, severe cold, altitude sickness, and profound psychological trauma as they watched their companions die one by one from injuries, malnutrition, and exposure. What makes this event particularly disturbing is not merely the survival struggle itself, but rather what the survivors felt compelled to do in order to continue living. They made the conscious decision to consume the bodies of those who had already perished, understanding that without this source of protein, they would all eventually succumb to starvation. This act, which modern sensibilities might find abhorrent or taboo, was approached by these men with remarkable pragmatism and even spiritual resolution, as several were deeply religious and found ways to rationalize their choice through the lens of their faith. The mechanism at work here reveals something fundamental about human survival instinct that transcends cultural conditioning. When faced with absolute certainty of death, the brain's self-preservation systems override the social taboos we normally consider inviolable, transforming the unthinkable into the necessary. Yet what haunts us about this story is not the desperate rationality of those choices made in extremity, but rather how we continue to mythologize and even celebrate the survivors while remaining deeply uncomfortable with the actual means of their survival, creating a strange cognitive dissonance where we admire their will to live while simultaneously recoiling from the mechanism that enabled it. On November 20, 1820, a sperm whale of extraordinary size rammed the whaling ship Essex in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, a collision so violent and deliberate that it created a hole below the waterline and began to sink one of the most formidable vessels in the American whaling fleet. The whale, described by surviving crew members as measuring at least 85 feet in length, had approached the Essex from the starboard side with what witnesses described as intentional aggression, backing away, and then charging a second time with such force that the ship's wooden hull fractured irreparably beneath the weight and momentum of the creature's massive head. This was not a defensive action born from the whale being hunted, as the Essex had not yet begun their assault on this particular animal, but rather an offensive maneuver that fundamentally challenges our understanding of animal behavior and suggests a level of cognition, and potentially even emotional response that modern cytology only partially comprehends. The Essex sank in less than an hour, leaving 90 crew members adrift in small boats with minimal provisions across one of the world's most remote stretches of ocean, an ordeal that would ultimately last more than 3 months and result in such severe starvation that the survivors were forced to contemplate and later engage in cannibalism to remain alive. The psychological mechanism at work here extends beyond simple animal aggression. It appears to involve recognition, memory, and possibly a deliberate choice to attack, as sperm whales possess some of the largest brains on Earth and demonstrate complex social structures, communication systems, and the capacity for what researchers now interpret as coordinated hunting strategies and even social teaching of learned behaviors. On the 15th of December 1900, the steamship Archtor passed the remote Scottish lighthouse situated on the island of Eilean Moor in the Flannan Isles and noticed something profoundly wrong. No light was shining from the tower that night. When a relief crew was finally dispatched to investigate the abandoned structure days later, they discovered an inexplicable scene that would haunt maritime history for over a century. All 3 lighthouse keepers had vanished without trace, leaving behind a puzzle so thoroughly unsolvable that it has spawned countless theories, investigations, and paranormal explanations that persist to this very day. The logbook entries stopped abruptly. The beds were unmade, a meal had been left half-prepared in the kitchen, and most disturbingly, the entrance door was found locked from the inside, suggesting that whatever transpired occurred with the keepers still secured within their isolated prison. The weather had been severe that week, yet the lamp room was spotless, and the light had been carefully extinguished rather than abandoned in crisis, implying a deliberate action taken by someone still present. The mechanism of this mystery draws its psychological power from our fundamental human need for rational explanations and closure, particularly in cases involving complete and total disappearance without evidence, without bodies, without even a coherent narrative that would allow us to comprehend what happened to these men. Yet despite decades of logical investigation, despite reasonable theories about storms washing men away or psychological breakdown leading to desperate acts, the Eilean Mor case persists in popular culture and paranormal folklore as an unsolvable enigma, a genuine mystery that defies explanation, almost as if we as a society have collectively decided that some events deserve to remain unknowable. To remain disturbing precisely because they cannot be neatly explained away or rationalized into comfortable understanding. And we continue to retell this story with the same mixture of fascination and dread that requires no resolution to maintain its haunting power over our imagination. On the 15th of December in the year 1990, a supply ship approached the Flannan Isles, a remote and desolate archipelago situated some 20 miles off the coast of Scotland, consisting of 7 small islands where a lighthouse had been established to guide vessels safely through the treacherous northern waters. When the crew arrived at the lighthouse to deliver provisions and to relieve the 3 lighthouse keepers who maintained the structure, they found the doors unlocked, the beds unmade, a meal left half-prepared on the table, and the lamp unlit, yet there was no sign whatsoever of the 3 men who should have been present. No bodies, no blood, no obvious struggle, nothing but an eerie absence that would ignite one of maritime history's most enduring mysteries. The 3 men, including the principal keeper James Ducat, were simply gone, vanished as if they had stepped off the edge of the world itself, leaving behind only their personal belongings, their daily logs showing routine entries up until the morning they disappeared, and their lighthouse standing silent and empty on the rocky island. What renders this mystery so psychologically disturbing is the complete absence of rational explanation, despite the intensive investigation that followed, which examined every conceivable theory from suicide pacts to abduction to mysterious accidents. Yet none could account for the simultaneous disappearance of 3 grown men from an isolated lighthouse with no apparent means of escape or method of death. The human mind gravitates toward mystery because uncertainty triggers our deepest anxieties about the fragility of our existence and the limits of our understanding. And the Flannan Isles case perfectly embodies this primal fear by presenting a scenario that defies the logical narratives we construct to make sense of the world around us. On January 5, 1921, the American merchant ship Carroll A. Deering was discovered beached on Diamond Shoals near Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, in a position that suggested deliberate abandonment rather than accidental wreckage, and every single member of her crew had vanished without explanation, leaving behind a vessel that appeared largely intact with supplies still aboard, and personal belongings scattered throughout the quarters as though the men had simply ceased to exist in an instant. The ship had been a 5-masted schooner engaged in routine coastal commerce, crewed by experienced sailors who understood the risks of their profession. Yet the circumstances of their disappearance defied rational explanation, as the vessel showed no signs of catastrophic damage, piracy, or struggle, only the eerie absence of human life and the haunting mystery of what compelled an entire crew to leave their ship behind in the middle of the night. The psychological weight of this mystery persists because it represents a fundamental breakdown in causality itself. We understand shipwrecks, we comprehend storms and mechanical failures and acts of violence. But the inexplicable voluntary abandonment of a seaworthy vessel by experienced mariners who would have understood that remaining aboard offered better survival prospects than striking out into the Atlantic challenges our ability to construct a coherent narrative from available evidence. Over the decades, theories have accumulated like barnacles on a hull: pirate attack, mutiny, sudden illness, abduction, murder, yet none satisfactorily explains the totality of what was observed, and the lack of any definitive conclusion has allowed the Carol A. On the 16th of October 1955, the cargo ship Gita departed from Apia, Samoa, carrying a crew of 25 men and bound for the Tokelau Islands with a shipment of trading goods and supplies that would sustain the remote atoll communities for months to come. The vessel was considered reliable and well-maintained, captained by experienced mariners who had navigated these Pacific waters countless times before, and yet 5 days into what should have been a routine voyage, the ship simply ceased to exist as far as the world was concerned, vanishing into the vast expanse of ocean as completely as if it had been swallowed by some unseen force. 22 days later, the Gita was discovered drifting unmanned in the waters near Fiji, floating eerily without power, abandoned of all human life, its lifeboats missing, its radio equipment damaged, and its holds filled with water though curiously not sinking. The discovery mechanism that governs such mysteries operates on the principle that when a vessel disappears without explanation, the human mind instinctively attempts to construct narrative frameworks to explain the inexplicable, searching desperately through logical categories of disaster such as storm, mechanical failure, mutiny, or attack, yet finding that none of these conventional explanations align perfectly with the evidence that eventually emerges. The ship was found in relatively calm seas, its engine capable of functioning, its cargo largely intact, and the food supplies untouched, suggesting that whatever occurred happened neither gradually nor catastrophically in the traditional sense, but rather as some sudden event that prompted an evacuation so urgent that the crew abandoned their vessel without completing basic survival protocols or leaving behind any written explanation of their departure. In April of 1943, a United States Army Air Force's B-24 Liberator bomber designated as the Lady Be Good took off from Libya on what should have been a routine bombing mission over the Italian city of Naples, carrying a crew of 9 men through the darkened North African sky. After completing their bombing run and turning back toward their base, the aircraft encountered unexpected headwinds that consumed fuel at an alarming rate, and as the pilots desperately searched for their airfield through the darkness and sandstorms, they became increasingly disoriented, flying past their intended landing zone entirely. When fuel finally ran critically low, the crew made the decision to bail out over what they believed was friendly territory, parachuting into the vast expanse of the Libyan desert below. What followed was an ordeal of staggering proportions, as the 9 men found themselves stranded in one of Earth's most inhospitable environments, hundreds of miles from rescue, with minimal supplies and no clear sense of their location. Over the following days and weeks, the crew members gradually succumbed to the relentless heat, dehydration, and despair, their bodies scattered across the desert floor as some attempted to walk to safety, while others remained near the wreckage. The deepest disturbance lies not merely in their suffering, but in the psychological mechanism that binds such tragedies to collective memory. We are drawn to stories where human vulnerability is exposed against natural forces so indifferent and overwhelming that individual will becomes meaningless, where technology and preparation offer no protection whatsoever. The Lady Be Good remained undiscovered in the Sahara for 16 years, a ghost aircraft preserved in the dry air, before being stumbled upon in 1958, its log books and documents still intact, telling the story of a crew whose final moments were documented in meticulous detail, yet utterly unable to alter their fate. On April 4, 1943, a United States Army Air Force's B-24 Liberator bomber departed from Libya on a nighttime bombing run toward Naples, Italy, carrying a crew of 9 men who would never return home alive. The aircraft, named Lady Be Good by its pilots, completed its mission successfully and turned back toward its base, but what happened next would become one of aviation's most haunting mysteries. Due to a combination of navigational errors, instrument failures, and the absolute darkness of flying over the Mediterranean Sea at night, the pilots became completely disoriented and flew far past their intended landing strip, continuing southward into the vast emptiness of the Sahara Desert. The crew, believing they were approaching their airfield, began preparations for landing, but instead found themselves over endless dunes of sand with no runway in sight. Running critically low on fuel and unable to locate their position, the pilots made the decision to ditch the aircraft, executing what would be remembered as a remarkably smooth crash landing in the desert. The fuselage came to rest intact, giving the 9 men a fighting chance for survival in one of Earth's most inhospitable environments. What unfolds from this moment represents a slow-motion tragedy, where human survival instincts collided with the absolute indifference of nature, creating a narrative of desperation that unfolded over weeks. The crew survived the initial crash, but faced an impossible situation. They were stranded in the Sahara with minimal water, no clear way to signal for rescue, and no certainty anyone knew their location. Some of the men attempted to walk out of the desert, believing they could reach inhabited areas, but the vast distances and extreme heat proved insurmountable. One by one, the crew members succumbed to dehydration, starvation, and exposure, their bodies scattered across the dunes like archaeological remnants of human fragility. The aircraft itself sat undisturbed in the sand for 16 years, a perfectly preserved metal tomb holding the physical evidence of their fate. On September 29, 1957, in the remote Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union, a catastrophic explosion occurred at the Mayak nuclear weapons production facility near the small town of Kishtim, an event so severe that it would remain one of the most significant nuclear disasters in human history, yet it remained almost entirely unknown to the outside world for nearly 3 decades. The facility had been built in secrecy during the Cold War to produce plutonium for Soviet nuclear weapons, and like many such installations of that era, it operated with minimal safety protocols and virtually no regard for the surrounding environment or population. A tank containing liquid radioactive waste that had been accumulating for years suddenly ruptured, and the subsequent explosion scattered approximately 2 million curies of radioactive material across an area of roughly 1,000 square kilometers, contaminating forests, rivers, and the homes of approximately 270,000 people living in the region. The Soviet government, operating under a doctrine of absolute secrecy regarding nuclear matters, immediately classified the disaster and evacuated nearby communities without explaining why, creating a vast exclusion zone that would remain closed off from the rest of the world for decades. What makes the Kishtim disaster psychologically and sociologically significant is not merely the magnitude of the radiation released, but rather the mechanism by which an authoritarian government could completely suppress knowledge of such a catastrophe, preventing even the affected population from receiving accurate information about the dangers they faced or the long-term health consequences they should monitor. The mechanism of this suppression operated through the combination of state control over all information channels, the classification of nuclear facilities as military secrets, and the fundamental prioritization of national interests and weapons development over individual safety and well-being. In the year 1987, in the Brazilian city of Goiânia, an abandoned radiotherapy clinic contained within its walls a machine that would soon transform from a forgotten relic into an agent of invisible contamination and slow-moving tragedy. Inside this neglected facility sat a cesium-137 source, a small metallic capsule no larger than a pea that contained enough radioactive material to render an entire city uninhabitable. Yet it was left unguarded and unlabeled, waiting for someone to find it. When 2 scrap metal collectors discovered the machine and began dismantling it for its valuable components, they exposed the glowing capsule within, unaware that they were holding something far more precious and far more dangerous than any metal they had ever encountered. The ethereal blue light that emanated from the capsule seemed almost beautiful to them, a mysterious and otherworldly radiance that compelled curiosity rather than caution, and they carried it home to show their families, to examine it more closely, to understand what they had found. Over the following days and weeks, the cesium spread through the city like an invisible phantom, contaminating homes and schools and markets, entering the bodies of dozens of people through breathing and ingestion, settling into their bones and organs where it would quietly emit radiation for years to come. The psychological mechanism underlying this disaster lies in humanity's fundamental disconnect from invisible threats, our tendency to trust what we can see and touch, while remaining blind to the dangers that exist beyond our sensory perception, and in the false sense of security that comes from not understanding the true nature of radioactive materials and their capacity for harm. In the years following the Second World War, as nuclear science raced forward with barely contained ambition, a particular sphere of plutonium became known throughout Los Alamos and beyond as the Demon Core, a nickname that would prove darkly prophetic. The object itself was a 4-inch diameter ball of plutonium-239, weighing approximately 6.2 kilograms, which sat in laboratories where scientists conducted experiments to understand the precise conditions required for a critical nuclear chain reaction. What made this sphere uniquely terrifying was not merely its radioactive nature, but rather the specific series of accidents that befell it, as though the object itself possessed an almost sentient malevolence. On August 21, 1945, physicist Harry Daghlian Jr. was performing a routine experiment involving neutron reflection, stacking tungsten carbide bricks around the plutonium core to study how neutron density increased, when he accidentally dropped one of the bricks directly onto the sphere, immediately triggering a blue flash of Cherenkov radiation as the core went supercritical. He quickly knocked the brick away with his hand, stopping the chain reaction within seconds, yet the damage was done. Daghlian had received a lethal dose of radiation and would die 25 days later from acute radiation poisoning, his body systematically failing as the radiation destroyed his cells from within. Nearly a year later, in May of 1946, the very same plutonium core claimed another victim when physicist Louis Slotin, perhaps the most respected and careful scientist in the room, was demonstrating the experiment to a group of colleagues when the uppermost neutron reflector accidentally slipped from his fingers and fell onto the sphere below, once again triggering that same ominous blue glow that signaled supercriticality. Slotin immediately knocked the reflector away, his quick thinking immediately ceasing the reaction, yet he too had absorbed a fatal dose, and he would die 9 days later from radiation sickness that consumed him with terrifying speed. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service initiated what would become one of the most egregious violations of medical ethics in modern history, a study conducted in rural Alabama that would deliberately withhold treatment from hundreds of African American men who had contracted syphilis, all in the name of observing the disease's natural progression. The researchers, led by Dr. John Cutler and others, recruited 600 impoverished sharecroppers under the pretense of offering free health care for a condition they called bad blood. But what they were actually doing was monitoring these men's deterioration over decades while possessing the knowledge and means to cure them. When penicillin became widely available as an effective treatment in the 1940s, the researchers consciously chose to continue the study without informing participants, ensuring that men who could have been cured instead progressed into tertiary syphilis, experiencing blindness, dementia, paralysis, and inevitable death. The psychological mechanism that permitted this atrocity operated on several levels. Racial dehumanization allowed researchers to view their subjects not as human beings deserving of basic dignity and medical care, but as experimental specimens whose suffering was scientifically valuable, their lack of agency justified by paternalistic assumptions about poverty and illiteracy. The bureaucratic distance between decision-makers and consequences meant that each individual act of withholding treatment could be rationalized as merely following protocol, preventing anyone involved from confronting the cumulative moral weight of their choices. Deep within the forests of Manchuria during the Second World War, the Imperial Japanese Army operated a covert biological warfare research facility known as Unit 731, where approximately 3,000 human beings were subjected to some of the most gruesome and scientifically fruitless experiments ever documented in human history. The facility, disguised as a lumber mill and water purification center, employed over 3,000 staff members who conducted live vivisections, limb amputation experiments, plague infection studies, and exposure to extreme temperatures on prisoners who were deliberately infected with diseases including plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhus. Researchers would infect subjects with pathogens and then deliberately delay treatment to observe the progression of illness, or they would remove organs from living victims without anesthesia to study disease development in real time, often killing subjects in the process and replacing them with new victims to continue their research. The commanders and scientists involved operated under the belief that data gathered through such means would provide military advantage, though the experiments were largely uncontrolled, scientifically invalid, and driven more by sadistic impulse than by any coherent research methodology. What makes this phenomenon particularly disturbing is the psychological mechanism that allowed thousands of educated professionals, many with medical training, to participate in systematic torture under the veneer of scientific inquiry, transforming the language of research and progress into a justification for absolute cruelty. The perpetrators compartmentalized their work, viewing their victims as subhuman or as necessary sacrifices for national strength, allowing them to convince themselves that their actions served a greater purpose. Between 1939 and 1945, Nazi Germany implemented a systematic program of forced euthanasia, codenamed Action T4, named after the address of its administrative headquarters at Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, which operated as a coordinated effort to eliminate individuals deemed unfit to live according to Nazi racial and eugenic ideology. The program initially targeted patients with severe mental illnesses, physical disabilities, and developmental disorders across state institutions, psychiatric hospitals, and care facilities throughout occupied territories, eventually expanding to include other groups deemed socially or genetically undesirable. Approximately 250,000 people were killed through this program using various methods including lethal injections, gas chambers disguised as shower facilities, and starvation protocols, with the systematic nature of the operation requiring extensive bureaucratic infrastructure, medical cooperation, and logistical planning that transformed murder into an administrative process. The psychological mechanism behind Action T4 operated through the gradual dehumanization of disabled individuals by framing them as economic burdens, genetic threats, and obstacles to national purification, while simultaneously employing medical and scientific language to legitimize killing as a humanitarian act of mercy, thereby allowing perpetrators to rationalize their participation as necessary and even compassionate. Doctors signed death certificates, nurses administered lethal drugs, administrators processed paperwork, and transportation workers moved victims between facilities, with each participant able to compartmentalize their role as merely technical rather than moral, creating a system where responsibility became so distributed that individuals could convince themselves they bore no personal culpability. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, the Central Intelligence Agency conducted an extensive and largely classified program known as MK-Ultra, which involved the systematic administration of LSD and other psychoactive substances to unwitting human subjects in an attempt to develop mind control techniques and interrogation methods. The program was approved at the highest levels of government and involved collaboration with major universities, hospitals, and prisons across the United States and Canada, with researchers injecting prisoners, psychiatric patients, and ordinary citizens with powerful hallucinogenic drugs without their knowledge or consent, sometimes repeatedly over months or years, while documenting their psychological deterioration with clinical detachment. The stated purpose was national security, the idea being that if the Americans could unlock the secrets of chemical mind control before the Soviet Union did, it would provide an insurmountable intelligence advantage during the Cold War. What made this particularly disturbing was not merely the violation of human autonomy or the physical and psychological trauma inflicted, but rather the methodical, bureaucratic manner in which it was conducted, with researchers filling out forms and publishing findings as though they were engaged in legitimate scientific inquiry. Creating detailed records of human beings experiencing complete psychological dissolution under the influence of powerful drugs administered without their understanding or agreement. The mechanism that allowed this to occur involved several layers of institutional rationalization. The compartmentalization of information so that most government officials never fully grasped the scope of the program, the designation of certain populations as acceptable test subjects because they were already marginalized and therefore deemed expendable, and the framing of scientific advancement as a moral imperative that justified any means necessary to achieve it. In the years following the end of World War II, as the United States government sought to understand the effects of radiation exposure on the human body, a classified program emerged from the shadows of scientific inquiry that would remain hidden for decades. Project Sunshine, as it came to be known, was initiated by the Atomic Energy Commission with the explicit purpose of collecting and studying human tissue samples, particularly bones from deceased infants and children across America and around the world. The researchers involved in this program believed that by analyzing strontium-90 and other radioactive isotopes that had accumulated in skeletal remains, they could better comprehend the biological pathways of radioactive contamination and establish safer standards for nuclear weapons testing and atomic energy development. What made this project particularly disturbing was not merely its scientific objective, but the manner in which tissue samples were obtained without informed consent from families, often taken from hospital pathology departments, medical examiners, and cemeteries without notification to grieving parents or relatives. The psychological mechanism that enabled such a program to exist and persist operated on several levels simultaneously. First, there existed a profound faith in the supremacy of national security concerns over individual rights, a belief that the greater good of understanding atomic science justified the violation of bodily autonomy and the desecration of the deceased. Second, there was an implicit assumption that because the subjects were deceased infants and children, their bodies had become mere biological material, stripped of the moral weight that might attach to living persons or even to the bodies of adults. Additionally, the program thrived in an era of compartmentalized knowledge, where government agencies operated with minimal oversight, and the public remained largely ignorant of classified medical research. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo conducted an experiment at Stanford University that would fundamentally challenge our understanding of human nature and the power of situational forces over individual morality. Zimbardo recruited 24 college students, all psychologically screened as normal and healthy, and randomly assigned them to play the roles of either prisoners or guards in a mock prison constructed in the basement of Stanford's psychology building. The guards were given uniforms, sunglasses, and wooden batons, while the prisoners were stripped, deloused, dressed in identical smocks, and assigned numbers rather than being called by their names. What began as a planned 2-week study rapidly descended into a psychological nightmare that had to be terminated after merely 6 days because the situation had become genuinely dangerous and psychologically damaging. The guards, who had been given no specific instructions on how to treat prisoners, began spontaneously developing increasingly harsh and dehumanizing behaviors, implementing arbitrary rules, conducting late-night inspections, and subjecting inmates to psychological manipulation and humiliation. The prisoners, conversely, began internalizing their powerlessness, with some becoming passive and withdrawn, while others organized rebellions that were viciously suppressed. And remarkably, several prisoners requested to be released from the experiment during the study, while others seemed reluctant to abandon their assigned roles, even when given the opportunity. The experiment revealed how readily ordinary individuals will conform to situational demands and social roles, how quickly institutional structures can corrupt behavior, and how the mere act of assigning power and authority can transform seemingly good people into perpetrators of cruelty. In the early 1960s, a Yale psychologist named Stanley Milgram conducted a series of experiments that would become among the most ethically troubling and psychologically revealing studies in the history of behavioral science, fundamentally challenging our assumptions about human nature and moral agency in ways that continue to haunt us decades later. The experiment was framed as a study on learning and memory, but what Milgram actually discovered was far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Ordinary people, when placed in positions of authority and given explicit instructions to continue, would willingly inflict severe pain on another human being, even when hearing the screams and pleas of their victims through the laboratory walls. Participants were told they would play the role of a teacher, tasked with administering electric shocks of increasing voltage to a learner whenever that person answered questions incorrectly, with the voltage beginning at harmless levels and rising incrementally toward what was labeled as deadly 1500 volts, though no actual shocks were ever delivered. The learner was actually an actor who performed increasingly realistic expressions of agony, begging the experimenter to stop, crying out about heart conditions, and eventually falling silent as though dead or unconscious. Yet when the experimenter calmly instructed participants to continue, saying phrases like "you have no choice, you must continue," the majority of subjects complied, pulling the lever repeatedly despite their visible distress and moral objections. What Milgram uncovered was the profound human susceptibility to authority, the way ordinary conscience can be suspended when responsibility is transferred to an authority figure, and how the incremental nature of harm makes it psychologically easier to continue than to stop and confront what one has already done. In 1939, at the University of Iowa, a speech pathologist named Wendell Johnson conducted what would become one of the most ethically troubling psychological experiments ever performed on children, an experiment that remained largely obscured from public consciousness for decades until its horrifying details finally emerged in the late 20th century. Johnson selected 22 orphan children, dividing them into two groups, and subjected one group to intense negative speech criticism while praising the other group's speaking abilities lavishly, all while the children were developing their language skills during their most formative years. The criticized children were told repeatedly that they spoke poorly, that they stammered and stuttered, that their speech was defective and embarrassing, a relentless barrage of psychological abuse disguised as scientific observation and speech correction. What Johnson discovered, or perhaps what he engineered through his intervention, was that children who had never experienced speech problems before his study developed genuine stuttering and speech anxiety as a direct result of his criticism and negative reinforcement, creating the very pathology he claimed to be investigating. The mechanism behind this phenomenon reveals the fragile nature of childhood development and how powerfully suggestion and authority figures can shape the psychological and neurological development of young minds. How the internalization of criticism during critical developmental windows can literally rewire the way a child's brain processes language and self-perception. The truly disturbing aspect of the monster study, as it came to be known, is not merely that it happened, but that similar principles of psychological suggestion and authority-based manipulation continue to echo through educational systems, parenting practices, and clinical settings around the world, where children internalize the criticisms and judgments of adults in positions of power, creating self-fulfilling prophecies of inadequacy and dysfunction that persist throughout their entire lives. In 1920, at Johns Hopkins University, a psychologist named John Broadus Watson conducted an experiment on an infant boy known only as Albert B., a pseudonym that would echo through the decades of psychological ethics discourse that followed. Albert was approximately 9 months old when Watson and his graduate student Rosalie Rayner began their work, selecting him from the hospital where his mother worked as a wet nurse. The experiment itself was deceptively simple in design, but profound in its implications. Watson presented Albert with various neutral stimuli including a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, and a seal skin coat, observing that the infant showed no fear of these objects. However, whenever Albert reached toward the white rat, Watson would strike a steel bar with a hammer directly behind the child's head, creating a loud, startling noise that naturally frightened the infant. This pairing was repeated multiple times over several sessions, and gradually, Albert developed a conditioned fear response not only to the rat itself, but to other white, furry objects including the rabbit and even a white Santa Claus beard. The mechanism underlying this disturbing transformation was classical conditioning, the same principle through which Pavlov had trained dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell, but applied here to human emotional development in an infant who could not consent and could not escape. What makes this experiment particularly troubling in retrospect is not merely the methodology, but the casual cruelty embedded within it, the deliberate induction of psychological distress in a helpless child for the advancement of behavioral science. Watson had reportedly planned to perform a reconditioning procedure to reverse Albert's fears before the boy left the hospital, yet this correction never occurred, and Albert was discharged without intervention, carrying his newly acquired phobias into his future development. The experiment endured for decades as a foundational text in psychology, taught in classrooms and referenced in textbooks, normalized within academic circles despite its obvious ethical violations. In 1966, a sociologist named Laud Humphreys conducted what would become one of the most ethically controversial and psychologically revealing studies in the history of behavioral science, an investigation into the hidden sexual encounters that occurred in the public restrooms of parks and other urban spaces, particularly among men seeking anonymous encounters with other men during an era when such behavior was criminalized and deeply stigmatized. Humphreys, interested in understanding the motivations and patterns of these interactions, positioned himself as a lookout in these spaces, documenting the ritualized sequences of behavior that men would engage in, observing how strangers would communicate through glances, hand gestures, and subtle movements to establish mutual interest before proceeding to sexual activity, all within the confined space of a public facility that was nominally designated for basic hygienic purposes. What Humphreys discovered was a complex social system operating entirely beneath the surface of ordinary public life, a parallel world with its own rules, signals, and participant demographics that revealed something deeply human about desire, risk, and the need for connection among people whose identities and orientations were forced into absolute secrecy by the legal and moral frameworks of their time. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior becomes apparent when considering the intersection of fundamental human drives, social prohibition, and the paradoxical way that danger and transgression can become fused with intimacy and connection, creating an environment where the very illegality and shame surrounding the behavior paradoxically intensified its psychological appeal and bonding quality. Between 1951 and 1953, Swedish researchers at the Weipholm Institution for Mentally Disabled Children conducted a series of dental experiments that would later become recognized as one of the most ethically troubling studies in medical history, yet which proceeded with institutional approval and minimal resistance at the time. The experiments were ostensibly designed to investigate the relationship between sugar consumption and dental caries, a scientifically valid question that could have been answered through observational means alone, but instead the researchers deliberately fed subjects increasing quantities of sticky sweets, toffee, and chocolate specifically to induce tooth decay and monitor the resulting cavitation and bacterial colonization of their teeth. The participants were children, many of whom had intellectual disabilities and no capacity to consent, making them vulnerable subjects entirely dependent on institutional care and incapable of refusing the dietary manipulations imposed upon them. The researchers systematically documented the progression of decay, watching as their young subjects developed severe cavities and dental infections that caused pain and required extraction, all while maintaining meticulous records of which sugar products proved most efficient at destroying tooth structure. What made this particularly egregious was that the scientific premise did not require the deliberate harm of subjects. The relationship between sugar and dental decay was already well established through existing evidence, yet the researchers pursued active harm under the guise of generating more definitive data. The psychological mechanism at work was a profound compartmentalization of the researchers from the suffering of their subjects, treating the children not as individuals deserving of protection, but as experimental apparatus whose pain and dental loss were merely data points to be recorded and analyzed with professional detachment. Between 19,946 and 19,948, the United States Public Health Service, in collaboration with the Guatemalan government and researchers from Johns Hopkins University, deliberately infected hundreds of Guatemalan citizens with syphilis without their knowledge or informed consent, conducting experiments to observe the disease's progression and test potential treatments. The study targeted some of the most vulnerable populations imaginable: prison inmates, mental patients, and sex workers, individuals whom researchers believed society would not miss or whose suffering would generate minimal outcry, establishing a hierarchy of human value that determined who was expendable for the sake of scientific advancement. Researchers would deliberately expose subjects to the bacteria through various methods, including infected blood transfusions and direct inoculation of lesions, then observe how the disease developed while providing limited or no treatment, essentially condemning people to years of progressive illness and suffering in the name of data collection. The psychological mechanism driving this atrocity operated on the foundation of dehumanization, where researchers had constructed a framework in which certain populations were viewed as acceptable losses, as research subjects rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity and bodily autonomy, allowing scientists to compartmentalize their actions and view their work through a lens of pure scientific inquiry divorced from moral consequence. The study persisted for 2 years largely undetected because institutional oversight was minimal, because the victims were marginalized people without power to advocate for themselves, and because the research was conducted in a foreign country where American researchers operated with minimal accountability to local populations they regarded as less than equal. Between 1944 and 1974, the United States government conducted a series of experiments that involved injecting hospital patients, many of them poor, elderly, or mentally disabled, with radioactive plutonium without their knowledge or consent, all in the name of scientific research into how the human body processes this dangerous isotope. These injections were administered by researchers working under the auspices of the Department of Energy and various universities, with the stated purpose of understanding the biological effects and retention rates of plutonium in human tissue, information that was deemed crucial for the safety of workers handling nuclear materials during the Cold War era. The patients who received these injections, numbering at least 18 individuals, though likely many more whose records were lost or destroyed, were never informed of what was being introduced into their bodies, and many died years later from radiation-induced illnesses, while the government kept the program classified and hidden from public view for decades. The mechanism behind how such a violation could occur rests fundamentally on a hierarchy of human value that existed at that time, where certain populations, the institutionalized, the economically disadvantaged, racial minorities, and those without powerful advocates, were viewed as acceptable test subjects whose bodies could be sacrificed for the greater good of national security and scientific advancement. Researchers rationalized these experiments through the logic of medical necessity and national interest, believing that the advancement of nuclear knowledge justified the use of vulnerable subjects who could not refuse or escape, and this rationalization was enabled by institutional structures that placed no meaningful barriers between intent and action. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia became the site of one of the most extensive pharmaceutical and chemical testing programs ever conducted on human subjects, involving thousands of incarcerated men who volunteered for experiments in exchange for small monetary compensation and the promise of early parole. The tests ranged from relatively benign studies examining the effects of new cosmetics and deodorants to extraordinarily dangerous experiments involving dioxin, a highly toxic chemical compound used in herbicides, where prisoners' skin was deliberately contaminated with these substances to observe the resulting lesions, scarring, and long-term health deterioration. Researchers and pharmaceutical companies found in the prison population a captive, economically vulnerable group from which they could extract maximum data with minimal regulatory oversight, conducting studies that would never have been approved for the general population, including the deliberate infection of inmates with various pathogens to test new drugs and vaccines. The mechanism underlying this exploitation rested fundamentally on the perception of incarcerated individuals as less than fully human, as people whose civil rights and bodily autonomy had been legitimately forfeited through their convictions, combined with the economic desperation that made even dangerous experiments seem preferable to the alternative of remaining in prison without compensation. Pharmaceutical companies and research institutions rationalized these practices as necessary scientific progress, justifying the use of prisoner subjects by emphasizing the theoretical benefits to society and the supposed voluntary nature of participation, even as they deliberately targeted populations least able to refuse or seek alternative opportunities. In 1950, the United States military conducted a series of experiments off the coast of San Francisco that would remain classified for decades. Experiments in which harmless bacteria were deliberately sprayed over a densely populated city to study how biological agents could disperse through urban environments. The operation, codenamed Sea Spray, involved releasing clouds of Serratia marcescens, a bacterium found in soil and water that was believed to be entirely benign to human health, from a military vessel positioned in the San Francisco Bay while prevailing winds carried the bacterial clouds inland across the city's neighborhoods. The military wanted to understand dispersal patterns and infection routes, to map how an invisible pathogen could blanket an entire metropolitan area without detection. And so they seeded the air itself with living organisms and then waited to observe what would happen when those organisms encountered the bodies of unsuspecting residents. Within days, the San Francisco General Hospital began admitting patients with unusual urinary tract infections caused by Serratia marcescens, an organism that should not have been infecting people because it was supposed to be harmless, and yet here it was, demonstrating its capacity to invade human tissue and cause real disease. The military had fundamentally misunderstood or perhaps deliberately misrepresented the safety profile of their chosen agent, and in the process they had infected dozens of people, though fortunately the infections remained relatively mild and the operation was not immediately connected to any deaths. What makes this experiment particularly disturbing is not merely that it happened, but rather the entire philosophical framework that allowed it to happen in the first place. The notion that a dense urban population could be treated as a testing ground for weapons development, that the biological integrity of human bodies could be casually violated in the name of national security research, and that this violation required no consent, no warning, and no acknowledgement. In the mid-19th century, beneath the streets of Norwood in South London, a catastrophic public health crisis was quietly developing, one that would eventually claim thousands of lives and leave behind a macabre archaeological legacy that persists to this day. The Norwood Cemetery, established in 1837 as a response to London's severe overcrowding in its existing burial grounds, was meant to be a solution to the city's mounting problem of decomposing corpses and the diseases they spread through densely populated neighborhoods. However, what was intended as a modern, efficient answer to urban death became instead a sprawling necropolis of such staggering proportions that entire sections of ground would eventually collapse and crack under the sheer weight of human remains stacked layer upon layer beneath the surface. During the peak years of the Victorian era, particularly during periods when cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis swept through London's working-class districts with devastating regularity, the cemetery accepted bodies at an almost industrial pace, with gravediggers working continuously to accommodate the relentless influx of corpses. Mass graves were dug to accommodate the poorest citizens, those who could not afford individual plots, and these communal pits would be filled to capacity and then capped over, only to be reopened when the next surge of deaths arrived. What made the Norwood situation particularly disturbing was not simply the existence of mass graves themselves, which were common across Victorian cemeteries, but rather the systematic, barely concealed nature of the operation and the engineering failures that eventually exposed the horrifying scale of decomposition occurring beneath the seemingly peaceful gardens. The psychological mechanism at work here reflects a peculiar aspect of human civilization. We construct solutions to problems that are themselves symptoms of deeper systemic failures, and then we carefully layer systems of denial and aesthetic presentation over those solutions, creating physical and conceptual barriers between ourselves and the reality of what we have created. During the Great Plague of 1665, London experienced a catastrophe so overwhelming that the city's existing burial infrastructure simply could not accommodate the sheer volume of the dead. And so the authorities made a pragmatic but horrifying decision to excavate enormous communal pits throughout the city, where thousands upon thousands of corpses were deposited with minimal ceremony or individual recognition, creating what became known as plague pits. Some of which were reportedly so densely packed with bodies that they resembled grotesque layers of human remains stacked with mechanical efficiency. And these pits were scattered across London, with notable ones located in areas like Aldgate, Bishopsgate, and the parish of Stepney, where entire families were thrown together indiscriminately into these anonymous graves, their individual identities obliterated beneath the weight of collective death. The mechanics of this phenomenon emerged from a brutal mathematics of survival and practicality, as the plague was killing hundreds of Londoners daily at its peak, with some estimates suggesting that between 70 and 100,000 people died during that single year, and the city's gravediggers, clergy, and civic administrators simply became overwhelmed by the biological reality that no system designed for normal mortality could process such extraordinary death. And so the solution became one of expediency rather than dignity, with bodies sometimes wrapped only in cloth or placed directly into the earth in mass graves that became increasingly chaotic and poorly managed as the crisis deepened. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the Catholic Church faced an unusual problem that would lead to one of history's most bizarre religious practices, one that saw skeletal remains exhumed from Roman catacombs, dressed in elaborate silk robes, adorned with jewels and gold, positioned in glass-fronted reliquaries, and distributed throughout Europe as sacred objects of veneration. These were the catacomb saints, fictitious martyrs created from unidentified human bones discovered in the underground burial chambers beneath Rome, where early Christians and pagans alike had been interred for centuries. When the excavations began in earnest, the Church developed a theological framework suggesting that any skeleton found in these catacombs must necessarily be a Christian martyr, since they reasoned that non-believers would not have been buried in such sacred ground, creating a false but convenient assumption that allowed them to consecrate and venerate remains with complete historical fabrication. The bones were given fabricated names derived from Christian hagiography, outfitted in costumes of extraordinary opulence, including silk vestments embroidered with religious imagery, crowns fashioned from precious metals, and weapons or instruments suggesting their fictional methods of martyrdom. Then transported across the Alps to churches, monasteries, and noble families who displayed them as tangible evidence of divine presence. This practice persisted for roughly 2 centuries, creating thousands of these manufactured saints that became focal points of popular devotion, despite the fact that no one possessed any genuine knowledge about who these people actually were, what they believed, or whether they had died as martyrs at all. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea, among the Four People, a disease emerged in the 1920s that would fundamentally challenge our understanding of infectious disease itself. A condition called kuru that spread through a population with an almost ritualistic inevitability, claiming thousands of lives over decades. The disease manifested as a progressive neurological deterioration that began with tremors and emotional instability, advancing through loss of muscle coordination, involuntary movements, and eventually complete physical breakdown, leaving victims bedridden and unable to speak before death arrived, sometimes years into the illness's progression. What made kuru uniquely terrifying was the mechanism of its transmission, for it spread not through water or air or mosquitoes, but through the consumption of human flesh, specifically the brains of deceased relatives, a practice the Four People engaged in as an act of mourning and respect, grinding the remains of the dead into a paste that was consumed primarily by women and children within the community. The psychological framework supporting this practice was deeply rooted in cultural and spiritual belief, the Four understanding death as a fundamental rupture that required ritualistic closure, and consuming their ancestors was a means of honoring them and preventing their spirits from wandering in distress, a logic that made perfect sense within their worldview even as it unknowingly perpetuated an accumulating cycle of infection. What persists as deeply unsettling is how the disease continued to spread even after external contact revealed its connection to the practice, and even after the Four People themselves began to understand that their ancestral ritual was causing the deaths they mourned. Yet the cultural weight of these traditions, the emotional necessity of honoring the dead in the way their parents and grandparents had done, created a resistance to immediate cessation that extended the epidemic's timeline. Between 1915 and 1927, a mysterious neurological pandemic swept across the globe, silently consuming the minds of approximately 5 million people, with the vast majority never recovering consciousness. This was encephalitis lethargica, commonly known as sleeping sickness, though this name was something of a misnomer because the condition was far more sinister than mere sleep. Patients would develop high fevers, sore throats, and headaches before gradually descending into a state of profound lethargy, their eyes remaining open but seemingly unable to perceive the world around them, their bodies motionless in beds for months or even years, sustained only by feeding tubes and the diminishing hope of their families. Some patients existed in this twilight state for decades, conscious somewhere deep within themselves, yet utterly unable to communicate or move, trapped in what neurologists could only describe as a waking death. The condition struck suddenly and without warning, affecting people across all social classes and geographic regions, and what made it particularly disturbing was that medical science had virtually no explanation for what was happening or how to stop it. Researchers proposed numerous theories, suggesting viral infections, bacterial causes, or even psychological triggers, yet none could be conclusively proven, and the outbreak simply subsided as mysteriously as it had begun, leaving behind a generation of living ghosts whose consciousness persisted in immobilized bodies. What remains particularly troubling about sleeping sickness is how thoroughly it has faded from collective memory despite its staggering human cost, how we have largely moved past it without ever truly understanding what it was or why it came and went, and how many people today are entirely unaware that such a catastrophe ever occurred, despite the fact that hundreds of thousands of people existed in those vegetative states simultaneously. Their families watching helplessly as their loved ones slipped away into an unreachable darkness from which they could never return. In the summer of 1518, on a sweltering street in Strasbourg, France, a woman named Frau Trafia began to dance alone in the middle of the road with wild, frantic movements, as though possessed by an invisible force that would not allow her body to stop. Within a week, 34 people had joined her, their feet moving in rhythmic patterns against the cobblestone streets, their bodies drenched in sweat beneath the merciless heat. By the end of the month, approximately 150 people were dancing involuntarily throughout the city, and within a year, the number had grown to around 400 souls who could not cease their movements despite the agony that consumed their joints and muscles. The dancers moved for hours without rest, collapsing only when their bodies literally gave out from exhaustion, some falling to the ground in delirium or unconsciousness, yet continuing to twitch and jerk as though the compulsion remained even when conscious movement became impossible. The affliction was not confined to the poor or the mentally unstable, but affected people of all social stations, ages, and backgrounds, suggesting some kind of collective phenomenon rather than individual madness. Physicians of the era, bewildered and desperate, attempted to explain the dancing plague through the lens of their available medical theories, proposing that the dancers had somehow contracted a disease through corrupted air, or that their blood had become overheated, leading them to recommend increasingly vigorous dancing as a potential cure, as though more movement might somehow exhaust the mysterious force. The true mechanism behind this plague remains uncertain to modern observers, though historians and medical researchers have proposed theories ranging from ergot poisoning from moldy grain, which can cause hallucinogenic symptoms and involuntary muscle contractions, to the psychological trauma of living in a city ravaged by disease, famine, and religious fervor, where the collective anxiety of entire populations could manifest in shared psychosomatic symptoms that the mind and body acted out together in synchronized suffering. In January of 1962, in a small village school in Tanganyika, which is now known as Tanzania, a peculiar phenomenon began to unfold that would perplex medical professionals and psychologists for decades to come. A teenage girl at the Kashasha primary school started laughing uncontrollably, her body shaking with convulsive fits that seemed to have no physical origin or medical explanation. Within hours, her laughter had spread to her classmates like an invisible contagion, and within days, dozens of students were seized by the same compulsive, unstoppable laughter that rendered them unable to attend their lessons. The phenomenon continued to spread through the community with terrifying consistency, eventually affecting nearly 1,000 people across multiple villages, causing schools to close and families to isolate themselves in fear of whatever mysterious force was compelling their loved ones to laugh until exhaustion overtook them. The afflicted would describe overwhelming urges to laugh that they could not suppress or control, their faces contorted in expressions that seemed almost pained despite the laughter that poured from their throats, and many reported feelings of deep anxiety and sadness underlying the compulsive giggles. Medical examinations revealed nothing physically wrong with any of the victims, no infections or neurological damage, no toxins or poisons in their systems, leaving doctors utterly baffled as to the origin and nature of the epidemic. Psychologists and researchers eventually attributed the phenomenon to what is known as mass psychogenic illness, a condition in which psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms that spread rapidly through a population through suggestion, observation, and shared emotional vulnerability. In the winter of 1692, in the small Massachusetts settlement of Salem Village, a group of young girls began experiencing violent, unexplainable convulsions that would eventually lead to the execution of 20 people and the imprisonment of hundreds more in what became known as the Salem Witch Trials. The afflictions started with Betty Paris, the 9-year-old daughter of the local minister, and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams, who would contort their bodies into grotesque positions, scream incoherently, and claim that invisible witches were pricking and pinching their skin, causing them unbearable pain that physicians of the time could not diagnose or treat. As the weeks progressed, more girls in the village began exhibiting the same symptoms, their bodies seized by convulsions so violent that multiple adults were required to hold them down, their eyes rolling back into their heads, their limbs flailing with supernatural strength, and their voices producing sounds that witnesses described as inhuman and demonic in nature. The girls would accuse respected community members, including church elders and women of considerable social standing, of being responsible for their torment through witchcraft, and each accusation would spark investigations and interrogations that only seemed to intensify the convulsions and bring forth new allegations. Medical and psychological explanations have suggested that what the girls experienced may have been ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, a genuine neurological condition such as conversion disorder or mass psychogenic illness, or a deliberate performance born from the power and attention their afflictions granted them in a rigid Puritan society that offered few other avenues for adolescent girls to exercise influence or agency. In August of 1949, the quiet French town of Pont-Saint-Esprit experienced a collective descent into madness that would baffle medical professionals and authorities for decades to follow. Over the course of just a few days, more than 200 residents began experiencing violent hallucinations, convulsions, and psychological disturbances so severe that many required hospitalization, and some would never fully recover. The symptoms manifested with nightmarish consistency across the afflicted population, beginning with intense burning sensations in the limbs, followed by visual distortions where people reported seeing their own limbs transform into grotesque shapes, their hands appearing as if they belonged to animals, their bodies consumed by invisible flames. The town descended into a state of controlled panic as emergency wards filled with screaming patients, their minds fractured by visions that felt absolutely authentic to them, and the medical establishment found itself entirely unprepared to explain what was happening. For many years, authorities attributed the outbreak to ergot poisoning, a naturally occurring fungus that sometimes contaminates grain and produces compounds similar to LSD, with the theory suggesting that flour from a local baker had become contaminated and distributed throughout the community. However, decades later, declassified documents revealed a far more troubling possibility, suggesting that the French and American governments may have deliberately conducted covert experiments on the population using lysergic acid diethylamide as part of the broader Cold War intelligence operations. The distinction between accidental poisoning and intentional experimentation represents a fundamental shift in how we understand what occurred that summer, transforming a tragedy of nature into something far more sinister and deliberately engineered. In September of 1982, the United States experienced a moment of unprecedented terror that would fundamentally reshape how we think about consumer safety and the vulnerability of our most everyday products. In the Chicago area, 7 people died after ingesting Tylenol capsules that had been deliberately contaminated with cyanide, a lethal poison that kills by preventing cells from utilizing oxygen, essentially suffocating the body from the inside out. What made this crisis particularly haunting was the randomness of it, the fact that someone had methodically opened bottles of pain reliever on store shelves and replaced capsules with deadly compounds, transforming a trusted medication into an instrument of death without warning or apparent motive. The victims included a 12-year-old girl, a young flight attendant, a postal worker, and others going about their ordinary lives, simply trying to relieve a headache or minor ache, completely unaware that they were ingesting poison. The psychological mechanism underlying this crime's particular horror lies in the violation of trust that it represents, the breach of the implicit social contract we maintain with manufacturers and retailers who promise that products sealed and sold are safe for consumption, that the barrier between us and harm remains intact. When that contract is shattered, when we realize that something as mundane and accessible as a bottle of over-the-counter medicine could conceal lethal intent, it creates a cascading anxiety that extends far beyond the immediate victims. What persists despite having no logical reason to persist is a kind of ambient unease about purchased goods, a knowledge that while tamper-evident packaging and safety measures have been implemented, the fundamental vulnerability remains that determined malevolence can still find paths around our safeguards, and that we live in a world where someone was willing to poison strangers for reasons that may never be fully understood or explained. In the summer of 1944, the small Illinois town of Mattoon became gripped by a peculiar and terrifying panic that would grip residents for weeks, as an unknown person or persons began spraying a sweet-smelling chemical substance through the windows of homes during the night hours, causing temporary paralysis and nausea in those who encountered it. The first reported incident occurred on September 1st when a woman awoke to find an intruder outside her bedroom window, and though she could not clearly identify the perpetrator, she reported smelling an overwhelming sweet odor before experiencing a sudden inability to move her legs, a symptom that would become the hallmark of the gassers' attacks. What made this case particularly disturbing was not merely the violation of privacy or the physical effects, but the way in which the town's collective fear fed upon itself, transforming isolated incidents into a phenomenon that seemed to grow larger with each passing night as more residents reported encounters with the gasser, whether real or imagined. The psychological mechanism underlying such mass panic phenomena operates through a process known as collective psychology, wherein the shared awareness of a threat causes people to interpret ambiguous sensory experiences through the lens of that threat, meaning that ordinary sounds, smells, and shadows became potential evidence of the gasser's presence in residents' minds. People began installing locks they had not previously considered necessary, forming neighborhood watch groups, and lying awake at night listening intently for any unusual sound or scent that might signal danger, their heightened vigilance actually making them more likely to notice things they might otherwise have ignored. In the remote French province of Gévaudan during the 1770s, a creature of unknown origin began systematically hunting human beings with a precision and hunger that defied rational explanation. Between 1764 and 1767, this animal killed approximately 100 people, predominantly women and children, using a method so deliberate and methodical that witnesses described it as possessing an almost intelligent malevolence. The beast would approach villages, drag its victims from fields and roads, and leave them partially consumed in a manner suggesting not mere predatory hunger, but something closer to ritualistic murder. Descriptions from survivors and those who found the remains spoke of an animal unlike anything documented in natural history, massive and lupin yet somehow wrong in its proportions, with teeth that seemed too large and an unwavering focus on human flesh. The psychological impact on the region was profound and destabilizing, as the creature appeared to operate with strategic awareness, avoiding traps and hunters while selecting victims with apparent deliberation. The mechanism behind the horror lay partly in the fundamental human vulnerability to predation from a source that should not exist, an animal that violated the natural order of what people understood their landscape to contain. Hundreds of hunters mobilized across the province, yet the beast continued its campaign unabated, suggesting either a creature of exceptional intelligence or perhaps multiple animals working in coordination. Despite intensive hunting efforts and the deployment of mercenaries and professional trackers, the killings persisted with an almost contemptuous disregard for human attempts to stop them. Eventually, the attacks simply ceased as mysteriously as they had begun, leaving behind only documented victims and a historical record so detailed yet fundamentally unexplained that it remains unsettling even centuries later. In November of 1966, in the small town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, something began to appear that would baffle residents and investigators for months to come. A creature described as a massive humanoid figure with enormous bat-like wings and hypnotic red eyes that glowed in the darkness like automobile reflections, yet far more intense and purposeful. The sightings began when two young couples reported encountering the entity near an abandoned TNT plant on the outskirts of town, describing it as standing nearly 7 feet tall with a wingspan that seemed to stretch 10 feet or more. And though they drove away at high speeds, the creature allegedly kept pace with their vehicle with terrifying ease. What followed was an extraordinary wave of sightings across the region, with over 100 documented reports over the following 13 months, each adding details to a narrative that seemed increasingly impossible to explain through conventional means. The creature became known as Mothman, and people from all walks of life, including police officers and respected community members, came forward with their own encounters, describing feelings of dread and paralysis when confronted with the entity, and an inexplicable compulsion to look into those red eyes despite overwhelming fear. The psychological mechanism behind such mass sightings often involves what researchers call contextual reinforcement, where initial reports create a cultural framework that primes people to interpret ambiguous stimuli as confirmation of the phenomenon, and the human mind, particularly under stress or in darkness, is extraordinarily susceptible to pattern recognition errors and the inflation of mundane observations into extraordinary explanations. Nestled in the Uinta Basin of northeastern Utah, there exists a property known colloquially as Skinwalker Ranch, a sprawling stretch of land that has become the focal point of some of the most extensively documented and consistently reported paranormal activity in modern American history. Beginning in the mid-1990s, the property's owners began experiencing a cascade of bizarre phenomena that would only intensify over the following decades, including sightings of enormous humanoid creatures with disproportionate limbs, unidentifiable flying objects that defied conventional physics, unexplained animal deaths with surgical precision, and electromagnetic anomalies that rendered conventional equipment non-functional. The incidents were methodical and deliberate rather than random, suggesting an intelligence behind the occurrences, yet an intelligence that operated according to rules entirely incomprehensible to human observers. When the National Institute for Discovery Science became involved in the late 1990s, they deployed extensive surveillance equipment, conducted electromagnetic measurements, and documented hundreds of incidents through photographs and video evidence, lending an air of scientific legitimacy to what might otherwise be dismissed as rural folklore or mass hysteria. What makes Skinwalker Ranch particularly unsettling is not the individual reports themselves, but rather the consistency of the phenomena across multiple independent witnesses and their unwillingness to abandon the property despite escalating psychological and physical disturbances. The ranch has become a repository for phenomena that exist in the liminal space between folklore, psychological experience, and genuine physical event, resisting categorization and defying conventional explanation. The persistence of these reports, the involvement of credentialed investigators, and the willingness of successive property owners to remain despite documented disturbances suggests something worthy of serious consideration. Yet the experiences themselves resist verification in any conclusive way. On the evening of October 10, 1973, two men named Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker were fishing along the Pascagoula River in Mississippi when they reported experiencing something that would become one of the most credible UFO abduction cases in American history. According to their account, a beam of blue-green light suddenly enveloped them, and they found themselves paralyzed and unable to move or speak, their bodies seemingly suspended against their will. They described being lifted into a hovering craft where they encountered strange, cylindrical creatures with wrinkled skin and no visible eyes, yet somehow capable of perceiving their surroundings with an intelligence that seemed purposeful and deliberate. The beings allegedly subjected them to a physical examination of an invasive and deeply violating nature, using some form of scanning device to probe their bodies while they remained conscious and aware but utterly helpless to resist. The entire ordeal lasted approximately 20 minutes before they were inexplicably released and found themselves back on the riverbank with no clear memory of how they had returned, only fragmented recollections and a lingering sense of profound violation. What makes this case particularly compelling to believers and skeptics alike is the consistency of the witnesses' testimony, their willingness to submit to polygraph examinations which indicated they were truthful in their recounting, and the fact that both men seemed genuinely traumatized by whatever had occurred to them that evening. Yet from a psychological perspective, the human mind under extreme stress, fear, and unusual circumstances can construct elaborate narratives that feel completely authentic and emotionally real, even when the events described may have alternative explanations rooted in misidentification, hallucination, or unconscious confabulation. On the evening of April 24, 1964, in the small town of Socorro, New Mexico, a police officer named Lonnie Zamora was patrolling the area when he observed what he believed to be a car accident happening off a remote dirt road near the outskirts of town. Zamora drove toward the location to investigate, and what he encountered instead would become one of the most credible and thoroughly documented unidentified flying object sightings in American history. According to Zamora's detailed account, he observed a metallic, egg-shaped craft resting on the ground, supported by four leg-like structures, and painted with what appeared to be a red insignia on its side. The object was roughly 15 feet in length, and as Zamora approached the craft, he witnessed two humanoid figures dressed in white suits standing near the vessel, which subsequently ignited with a blinding blue flame and lifted silently into the air before vanishing over the horizon. The incident lasted approximately 10 minutes, and Zamora immediately reported his sighting to his superiors, providing a consistent and detailed account that would later be corroborated by multiple independent witnesses in the surrounding area who also observed unusual aerial phenomena at that exact moment. What makes the Lonnie Zamora incident particularly significant is that he was a trained law enforcement officer whose testimony carried considerable weight, and the sighting occurred in broad daylight rather than under cover of darkness, eliminating many conventional explanations involving astronomical phenomena or atmospheric illusions. The incident was investigated by the United States Air Force as part of Project Blue Book, and despite their extensive examination of the evidence and testimony, no satisfactory conventional explanation was ever offered, leaving the case officially unresolved. In July of 1947, a rancher named William Brazel discovered debris scattered across his property near Roswell, New Mexico, consisting of metallic fragments, wooden beams, and unusual material that he could not identify, which he subsequently reported to local authorities who arrived to collect the materials and ultimately issued a press release stating that the military had recovered a flying disc. A statement that was retracted within hours and replaced with an official explanation that the debris came from a classified surveillance balloon intended to monitor Soviet nuclear tests, an account that satisfied the public record for decades until the 1990s when the release of previously classified government documents, collectively referred to as the Roswell Memo, reignited speculation by revealing that the initial military assessment had been far more ambiguous than the public had ever been told, and that high-ranking officials had engaged in a deliberate and coordinated effort to contain and redirect narrative control over what had been recovered. The psychological mechanism underlying the enduring power of the Roswell incident operates through a fundamental human need to find meaning and coherence in gaps of information. And when official institutions provide contradictory accounts or later acknowledge that information was withheld, the human mind naturally fills those voids with alternative explanations that feel more satisfying or complete than official ambiguity. Particularly when the institutional narrative seems to shift or collapse under scrutiny.